today we're venturing into a new format by Zoom, a discussion meeting in which all of you who wish to participate may do so. The lag time between a person speaking and you getting it and hearing it and replying is always a challenge with Zoom, and all we can do is be patient and accept it and be aware of that lag time. So it'll be helpful if you keep yourself muted except when called upon to share, so that the recording won't have a lot of distracting noises. Also, if you need to jump up and run around the room, please stop your video share so we won't be distracted by that if we're recording in gallery view. And we're going to try and leave the recording on gallery so that we can see everybody who's attending. Okay, I've got one person who wants a text. Frank, could you text Salive and give her the link? She has texted me and she wants to join by phone. Please give her the phone number. We do, or Tom, text Salive and give Salive the phone number.
Yeah, I'll send it to her. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tom. So, drum roll. Without further ado, let's start with our speaker that we had last August, the one that, because even though we had two other speakers by Zoom, we don't have the recordings for Robert Wilkinson, who did a Zoom in May, or Susie Cox, who did a Zoom for us in June. Our little panel that we had last July announcing the Tucson Astrologers Guild Zooms on YouTube is a nice short little Zoom that anybody can access if you want to go and Google Tucson Astrologers Guild by YouTube, where we talk about why we do astrology. So August 2020 is our first real Zoom that we did with a speaker on our own channel, our own Zoom. So who would like to start off with sharing what they learned from Zane B. Stein about Chiron, the Chiron for 2020? Let me, I have his topic was Chiron yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Anybody wish to jump in and share a little bit about what they learned? Raise your hand, wave at me. I'll recognize you.
I will in a minute, Gail. I remember finally, that was after the stroke, and so I was having to notate everything. I have a notebook that I wrote everything in, and I'm now trying to process in my head where I put the notebook, and I think I figured out where it is. And in that, I have all of my notes, and then I'll be more than happy to share. I'm listening, but I'm going to black out my screen so I do not distract everybody.
Well, go find that notebook. I'll say a little bit about Zane. I took a lot of notes. Go find your notebook, Cece, so you can come back. I'm going to go through the speakers starting with August, coming through 2020 and into 2021. So in order. So Zane talked about Chiron going from Aries to Pisces, and being in Chiron in Aries being about self-centeredness, kind of sound like selfishness. He talked about Trump's immigration policy being a part of the cycle. He did talk about the fact that being in an elliptical orbit, Chiron in Aries is farthest from the sun, and it takes 8 years to transit through Aries, where in Libra it only takes 1.5 years. He gave us a whole lot of chart data for different people. The Black Lives Matter, when it started July 13, 2013 at 8 p.m. in Los Angeles, George Floyd, his birth date, and when he died. That's pretty interesting. Harvey Weinstein, the date of his being arrested at 1 degree Aries. Chiron in Aries, it says will bring crisis in weather, fires, drought, climate change. He gave Greta Thunberg's birth date rectified January 3rd, 2003, rectified to 8:14 a.m. in Stockholm. Chiron by transit, square her natal Chiron in the first when she became quite prominent in the news. Of course, he talked about the pandemics with the US having their Chiron return because their Chiron is in Aries. He said there was pandemics the last 2 times Chiron was in Aries. And we've got a Chiron guy here. If you'd like to say anything about Zanes or that Chiron in Aries, you're certainly welcome to give us a minute or two if you'd like to, Dale.
Hey, I think what I'd like to share is background. Originally, it was Al H. Morrison, the astrologer Al H. Morrison, who was not a wealthy man, but he put forward, he was actually on fixed income, and he put forward money to have Zane Stein get the ephemeris together for Chiron way back when. And then what Zane did is he had a international brainstorming session where he would send out, this is of course before the internet, and he would send out these funky paper emails, and anybody could write in anything they wanted of what they observed and thought about Chiron. So I was involved in that, and let's see if I got, I don't know whether this will show or not, but will this work? Anyway, I designed the button for Chiron the Key. And so we were trying to get this promoted to when people would go to astrological conferences to actually start talking about Chiron. So he was the one that really got astrologers together to bring Chiron forward, and particularly out of a spirit of brainstorming rather than just that he would put together what he thought. He got input from lots of other people. So I just wanted to share that, but I didn't have a chance to hear him last August.
Terrific. Thank you, Dale. That's great information. Cece, did you get your notes together? No, you couldn't find them. Okay. Anybody else have a recollection of Zane's lecture they'd like to share? Okay.
Can you hear me? Can
yes,
you hear me?
Diana.
Oh, okay.
Yes, you. Go ahead.
Well, I remember being in Chiron and Friends, what do you call it when people converse? Not a blog, but whatever. And I mostly lurked. But and I was really enthusiastic about it. And I told the girl that I took a lot of astrology lessons from, and she goes, that's space garbage. And I thought, So I really started looking at Chiron for myself, and then I noticed when it was conjunct the angles, it really had a message for me. And so it really got my attention after that. But some of the notes that I took, and I'm trying to read my scribble here. But Chiron and Aries, all this me, this was the seeds that were germinating and they broke through the surface. So yeah, that was a good analogy because there's a lot going on underneath that we can't see. But it wasn't sudden. He said they were brewing. And then it brought to mind, people refusing to wear a mask, my freedoms and blah, 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 and to heck with everybody else. So he brought up the vertex and anti-vertex as stimulating the awareness of being part of the universe, faded turning points. And he mentioned Alice Portman. My friend Janet Booth, she's spoken a few times on the vertex, so that was interesting. He talked about the Me Too movement. And he mentioned how Harvey Weinstein, is that how you say it? Weinstein or Weinstein? Yeah. He was afraid of his mother, terrified of things outside of his control. And I guess it's in the third house, which would make sense. So I didn't know that. So that's worth a look back at his chart during my free time. Not that it excuses his behavior, I might add. Oh, maybe I'll jump in later because I'm just trying to read my scribble. So
That's great, Diana. Yeah, that's great. I appreciate Diana just doing her best to rewatch. I invited you all to rewatch any Zooms and let me know if you remember. You can always
I
contact me.
do have something to say. He talked about woundedness happening in childhood, and he spent a lot of time on that, and I thought that was really, I was just really impressed with his talk. It was just so thorough. And he talks, is he the one that talked about DNA methylation and how there's so many genes and they can be turned on or off or even dimmed, and the sex of the child at what stage of life is most affected by the father or the mother. And so, it's not that, it reminded me of the age-old question, nature or nurture, and this would strongly suggest that it's both. The DNA is a two-way environment. It's not just a blueprint. So I liked that.
That was really good, Diana. I'd forgotten all about that part of his lecture. That was very interesting. Thank you for that. Yes, Cece, anybody else? You're muted, Cece.
Can you imagine me being muted? From what I know of Chiron and my talks with Zane in the past, other than through the lecture, Chiron being the wounded healer. And so if you go through each of the signs that's in there, where like we're being pointed out, the angles were being affected, the 1, 4, 7, 10. It's a set off perimeter. But if you go through your own signs of where Chiron sits, if it's in Aries, as she's pointing out, is about that Me Too, but it's having you redirect and look at what is wounded that needs to be, how do you need to address it? Are you coming on too strong? So you need to find that balance. And then as it comes through the angles by transit, it's moving around. And you're hitting those angles in there, it's setting those perimeters of where that action's coming in from, as I understood Chiron from when I talked to Zane.
All right, great. Thanks, Cece. Okay, we probably should be moving on to our September speaker, if we're going to get through all of our speakers in a couple hours. But our next speaker is Philip Young, September 12, 2020. He's talking about the U.S. Pluto return. Who would like to jump in and share a little bit about Philip Young?
Gail, I would, if I could start off.
Great. Go for it, Tom.
Okay, yeah. Throughout the year, we have had a lot of our speakers talk about the upcoming Pluto return of 2022. And it's very significant, obviously, to the point where one of our speakers who's in Tucson, Larry Martin, made the comment in his predictions of 2021. He said basically that whenever a country has a Pluto return, it's not the same country after it's over. So I had listened to that talk that he gave. Unfortunately, I was hoping he was going to cover other countries that had gone through their Pluto returns to see what the consequences were. But he said he was preparing a talk just for that. So I just thought I'd start this by saying what he said was a very strong statement, that any country that experiences it is the country in name only after their Pluto returns. So in addition to the 2022 Pluto return of the United States, we're also going to have transiting Neptune in opposition to the US natal opposition in the natal chart. So I can't remember which speaker it was. I think it was Roy Gillette said when he was talking about Neptune and Pisces, he said that that's indicative of victimization. And I think that's what we're seeing now. I'm sorry, I'm talking about Neptune instead of Pluto, but I really think that's a really big keynote of Neptune and Pisces, is the victimization that a lot of people feel right now. Everybody feels wronged. I don't care who you are, what your political, whatever. Everybody in every spectrum feels that some wrong has been done, and maybe it has. Maybe they're all right. But I thought I'd mention that. I would like to mention one other thing about Neptune before I go on to Pluto and talk about what Philip had said. And that is that I remember at one of the UAC meetings, no, it was an ISAR meeting. I forgot if it was Shulman. I can't remember her first name. Was talking financial astrology. And what she said was, whenever Neptune goes into a fire sign, that is when we start getting extreme inflation. And I use that term extreme rather than hyperinflation because that is a term that's wrongly used. The term hyperinflation occurs when your money goes to half its value within 6 months, or your money, it requires double the money to buy the same object. So hyperinflation is not the term that you should look for in terms of the inflation that we're experiencing right now. Right now, we were given a shock, and maybe it's because Neptune is getting very close to Aries. It's still in Pisces, obviously, but it was reported that our inflation rate went from 2%, under 2% to 5%. And as you know, our inflation rates are calculated without calculating food or housing costs, which makes it a ridiculous number. The core inflation number is totally ridiculous. Doesn't include your food, doesn't include your housing. So that'll happen in 2024. And when it happened before, during the Carter administration, it happened, and that's where we saw 15% or more, 20% inflation. I remember reading the New York Times and other publications back then where they were talking about how people on Social Security had to eat dog food in New York City because they couldn't afford regular food. So we are not, we've had this kind of low inflation rate for a while. And I am concerned that in 2024, when Neptune goes into the fire sign, which is Aries, that's when we're going to see a huge increase of inflation. But I think we're getting indications of it right now. The other time that happened was during the Roaring 20s. And people don't realize we had a lot of inflation during the Roaring 20s. It's because the Federal Reserve, which was created in 1913, had basically printed a lot of money back then. So it allowed everybody to spend a lot of money. Everything was roaring until the Depression happened and the party was over. So, and that's also the time where you had at the end of World War I, you had the Weimar Republic of Germany having hyperinflation that was through the roof. You know, it cost $1 trillion to buy, you know, a loaf of bread by the time it was over. So
Where was Neptune? Well, are you relating that to a Neptune aspect?
yes, that's both the 1970s, the Carter and hyperinflation or inflation, high inflation, and the Weimar Germany roaring 20s was when Neptune went into a fire sign. So one of them would have been, it would gone, the one prior Carter era was probably Neptune going into Sagittarius. And the one in the 20s would be when it went into Leo. So it doesn't
Did
matter.
you want to say
Yeah.
anything more about the Pluto return
Yes,
and
I do.
Philip?
Yeah. So I just wanted to preface this. Pluto's about destruction and also regeneration. And because Larry has not prepared his talk on how it's affected other countries, I did find online an article by Ray Grassi, and it's called The United States Pluto Return. And I put the link into the chat, so you can click on that link and it'll bring you the webpage up. And you can read the article, you know, on your web browser, whatever you want. Ray does go into what happened to other countries. So he particularly focuses on England, which has had 3 Pluto returns, and Rome that had 2 Pluto returns. And it's not a pretty sight. So I would just probably just refer, because I've talked so much on Neptune instead, I would suggest you read that. Generally, there was extreme destruction in the country of England when they had their Pluto returns. And in certain cases, you got the regeneration. We had the Elizabethan age after that Pluto return of the 1500s. So it was positive because it cleared all the crap out for stuff to be rebuilt and regenerated. So, but we might be going through a world of hurt come next year and 2023 onward. If, you know, if we go the way of Rome and in England. Rome had a lot of problems. They had the invasion of the Vandals in one of their Pluto returns, and the other one they had assassinations galore and political insurrection. So we're already obviously feeling the Pluto return, but yeah, I suspect it's going to culminate in even more surprises.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah.
I know that
Can I
Philip did
add
share a
to
lot
that,
of
Jim, or
charts.
not? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. So Philip did share. I'm kind of wanting to go through our speakers, but maybe that's that format is.
Oh, if I could mention, Philip,
possible.
Philip Young is our webmaster, so we have a special place in our hearts for him. Yes.
Yes, indeed. So Dale, what did you want to say?
I just wanted to say quickly that I've looked into this also, and so what you might want to look into historically is Sir John Glibb, History of Empires, where he actually tracks the empires, and he said they run 250 years, but when we look at it, it's actually 248 most of the time. And what I found in terms of looking at this, if you do this Scottish reunification chart for the UK, that everything came to an end for the UK at the end of World War II, when the United States came into power at its Pluto opposition. And the difference between empires will be the Pluto aspects. The UK had Jupiter conjunct Pluto So it's come down was pretty easy. The U.S. has Pluto conjunct Mars.
Conjunct Mars.
Wow.
You mean for the actual transit, for the actual return?
In the natal chart, 1776, Pluto and Mars are conjunct. And
No,
so
Mars is 1776. Mars is in Gemini in the U.S. chart.
I'm sorry. I'm thinking of the Articles of Confederation chart. I'm sorry.
Right, you are.
Yeah.
I have that pulled up because you had mentioned it.
Yeah. Yeah. And
the article.
so basically, you know, as Tom was saying, it's like it's not a pretty end, but I think when Mars is involved, it could be, you know, particularly not near as nice as the easy come down for the UK.
I had also wanted to mention, Dale, that, you know, the U.S. chart, the Sibley chart, that occurs in the second house of our security, finances, whatever. And in the, sorry, I don't have the U.S. chart here, but in the, you know, the other chart that's the Gemini rising, it would be in the 8th house. So I think it might have to do with our finances, and also in the 8th, it would be our obligations to manage other countries and their, you know, your stuff.
Be the police force of the world, the police of the world.
Yeah, seeming as Biden is withdrawing us from Afghanistan, which all of our presidents do, and then they renege, you know, a couple weeks later. So who knows how that's going to work.
You know, I did want to mention the fact that Philip Young, he presented a lot of charts about with the returns. Of course, he covered what was coming up for the election, what was coming up for Inauguration Day, things like that, in preparation run up to the actual Pluto return. He said it's interesting to note that, and like later speakers did mention, Roy Gillett and others, that for this Pluto return, Uranus, that was in Taurus in 1941 with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Uranus again in Taurus, Neptune in Pisces. Neptune was in Pisces from 1848 to 1861 for the start of the Civil War. Neptune again in Pisces now, and it's actually that square to the nodes, I believe, and no, it's the transiting nodes are square. But Neptune in the U.S. chart is square Mars, and that's a real problem with this Neptune in Pisces opposing the U.S. natal Neptune square Mars aspect. So Pluto and reminded us that this the U.S. chart that the U.S. was born during with the Revolutionary War, and that's why, you know, with Pluto in Capricorn, it was a war that started this country. And if we're again in a war, it wouldn't be surprising with Pluto returning there. I did. The only hope he held out is that the powers that be always seem to, like criminals, or they always seem to make some major mistake that undoes them in the end. So we'll hope that that happens again for all the powers that are thinking they're so powerful in manipulating whatever's going on. That they will also undo themselves. But we do seem to be building up to in the drastic polarities that are unfolding in this country. We do seem to be building up to some real expressions of war, you might say. Okay, so
excuse me, Gail.
we've got to move on to the next speaker.
I'd like to ask Dale what the name of that book was about the empires and author again.
It's actually an essay, a long essay.
Okay.
And it's called The Fate of Empires by Sir John Glubb.
Thank you.
So we must move on. Our next speaker was Ren Butler on October 12th, 2020. He spoke about Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, and the death, rebirth, struggle of the human psyche. Derek, would you like to say something about Ren Butler's presentation?
Yeah, I actually I'm kind of unprepared to talk about his presentation, so I'd just like to review his general approach. I recommended him as a speaker and put Gail on to him. I believe I came across him at the listening to the Astrology podcast, or somehow I was very interested in his approach to astrology and humanism, and especially the Stanislav Grof's approach of holotropic breath work and the psychic result, the psychological approach that came out of that, and is it connection to Richard Tarnas. So this whole kind of thing of so I'm very interested in the connecting astrology to different psychological approaches, because I believe astrology is a master typology that you can stick these different psychological approaches into. And that was why I kind of was interested in this approach, this viewpoint, and listening to Ren Butler talk about it. And I guess that's about all I have to say.
Okay, yes, great. I took a lot of notes. He gave so many correspondences, and Tom said he noticed that too, to movies, as he talked about he was focused on the archetypes, the astrological archetypes, and how they were portrayed through the arts, through and the work that Groff did. Tom, you said you noticed Ren's allusion to all those movies, and how fascinating that was. Can you say something about that?
Oh, well, no, I don't really have a lot to say other than he did bring up, how astrological aspects of the time kind of reflected in the sentiments of songs and the themes of movies and that sort of thing. And I thought that was, fascinating. But he had quoted so many movies and songs, which I was furiously writing down because I was, immensely interested, in looking some of the stuff I'd never heard of or re-listening to it. So I don't really have much to say about that other than it was very entertaining, his talk.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It was. He mentioned about Richard Tarnas's book, Prometheus the Awakener. So bringing that into the idea of this work with Groff, The Awakening, but also the Groff's book, The Stormy Search for Self, the layers of human unconsciousness, the biographical, the perinatal, the transpersonal, and how illness and traumatic injury seem to be hard to release from people. And it's when we have these transits of these outer planets to important angles of our chart or personal planets, that it can be very useful to engage in this kind of work, this holotropic breath work. It can help us remember and release those traumas that are stored in our psyche. So yes, is very interesting, his talk. A lot to digest there, and so I recommend our members to ask me for the link if they would like to see Ren Butler's Zoom again.
Another thing that I thought was interesting is this particular correspondence of planets with stages of childbirth. That was very reminiscent of astrologer Donald Bradley, writing as Garth Allen. He also had a correspondence of planets with stages in our physical development, but it's different. But I kind of, this is what keyed me to this particular concept. He related Pluto to conception, Neptune to the uterine experience, Uranus to birth, the birth process, Saturn with the immediate post-birth process, and Stanislav Grof's correspondence is different, but rather similar. And I thought that was very interesting. Also,
Right.
yeah. Also, I'd like to add somewhat as an aside, but keying off what you said, Gail, is that oh man, I was about to say it. Oh yeah, the relationship of Pluto, or actually the relationship of Uranus to Prometheus. That maybe Prometheus is a better name for Uranus than Uranus is. There was another speaker who also thought that a better name for Neptune in terms of the mythological archetypes. Neptune is more related to Dionysus or Bacchus, and I tend to agree with that also. If you look at the raw descriptions of that Cyril Fagan wrote about how losing yourself, ecstasy, that seems to correspond more to Bacchus and Dionysus than it does to anything dealing with the god Neptune. So also I have this really interesting book, Dionysus, the god of ecstasy, which has a new translation, or the author's translation of the Bacchae. And I think that if you were to read that, that also has a lot to do. You get more insights into Neptune just by reading the characteristics of Dionysus as presented in the play.
Could I say one thing? I was just reading my notes on from Ren's talk, and he had mentioned the Saturn-Pluto square of 1984, and how that had brought about AIDS. And also at that time, you had Helen Caldicott, Dr. Helen Caldicott, who was the medical doctor, talking about nuclear winter and the problem of recycling and all that. So to me, it's not surprising that with Pluto and Saturn conjuncting when it did, that this may have brought on this whole phenomena of COVID-19. Anyway, can you hear me? I guess you can.
Yeah, we can hear.
Yeah.
We're really talking about fear. I mean,
Right,
Saturn
fear,
and Pluto
yes.
together are creating fear. It doesn't matter whether it's real or not, or whether it's really something that's got to be. But it's easy to spread the fear every time that those planets are aspecting each other. Then we have this major fear.
Yeah, and you have Saturn constriction, and now that Saturn's going into Aquarius as it has, now you're getting a little bit more rebellion, and so yeah.
Let me jump in here and interject something. Tom just mentioned 1984 with the Pluto-Saturn conjunction. Well, in my notes for Roy Gillette, who's the next speaker, actually. And he was talking mostly about economics, how the pandemic had caused a big crash economically because everybody quit working. And now we're talking about, bringing employment back up and blah, blah, blah. was the main focus of his talk. And he pointed out that Jupiter conjuncted Neptune in January of 1984. And he connected that to the expansion of debt because of the supply-siders with capitalism led by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. But also Neptune has to do with delusion, and Jupiter is expansion. So his interpretation was it made us believe we can go into debt infinitely and never have to pay the piper. But it also would correspond to building up, being fearful or being concerned about things that maybe we are deluded about. And that was January 19th, 1984, that Jupiter conjuncted Neptune. And coincidentally, the conjunction occurred at 1 minute of Capricorn, 0 degrees and 1 minute was the exact conjunction. You know, Capricorn is ruled by Saturn and tends to be kind of negative and pessimistic, very open to fear-based ideas about we can't do that, we shouldn't, it's dangerous. So it's kind of curious that this big, powerful Jupiter-Neptune conjunction was at 1 minute Capricorn in the same year that the Saturn-Pluto conjunction occurred, and you guys were just talking about the increase in fear. Anyway, I sort of sidetracked the conversation.
No,
but
no,
that in, 'cause
perfect. Perfect segue, Frank. Our speaker, Roy Gillette, October 13, 2020, he was the day after Ren Butler. He's talking about the astrology of world economy before, during, and after COVID-19. And Frank volunteered to say something about Roy Gillette. So continue. What else did you learn that you found useful?
Well, he went through a lot of very interesting astrological aspects in short, medium, and long-term stuff. For instance, he talked about the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn was in Earth signs for the last 200 years. Now it's going to be in air signs for the next couple of hundred years. And the interesting thing about how Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, all in Capricorn, and he had a chart where he worked with solar fire and gone backwards and forwards from 5000 BC to 5000 AD. And there were several times that were way back 2,000 or 3,000 BC, but then there was like a 3,000 year span. And the time that we have had this triple conjunction in Capricorn, excuse me, is like only the third time in the last 2,000 years. So above and beyond going, oh, Saturn is conjuncting Pluto or something like that, the whole idea of this energy is taking place in Capricorn is really outstanding. He talked a lot about the shift both in the past and presumably upcoming in our society and how we think of money and employment and responsibility and ownership. Basically, capitalism as we know it is really only about 200 years old. He had the birth chart of the Bank of England and tied that to what was going on with transits, and also the birth chart of the US Federal Reserve. And it was fascinating to see how 300 or 400 years ago, the ideas of employment and ownership of property and capital and money were very different from what happened after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and basically the start of capitalism and around the early 1800s. So basically for the last 200 years, our society has been taken over by this idea that businesses have to make money and people don't count except They're employees that do the work in the factory, and you pay them as little as you want, and you don't care if they get vacations or anything like that. He tied in things like the labor movement and so development of the ideas of socialism with some of these long-term trends. And basically that's kind of the summation of his whole entire talk, was the idea that we've been in this very Capricornian materialist, the people that have the money are in charge because they need to make more money, and governments should support them, and politicians should support them with tax breaks and all that. And who cares what happens to the little man? And of course, correspondingly also, who cares what happens to the environment? So the last 200 or 300 years, you know, with deforestation, with pollution in streams, with overfishing in the ocean, now we have global warming because of carbon dioxide from coal burning and oil burning, all this sort of stuff. What he was saying was, not only can you kind of philosophically or economically look at this whole development of economic thought from what we now call economists. You know, 200 years ago, they were like natural philosophers, but it's really developed into this discipline that has this mindset of, like I said, the rich have money and they deserve it, and they have to pay the little guy as little as they can and screw the environment. But he talked about some of these long-term trends about things like the Pluto return of the US and this shift of the Saturn and Jupiter, Jupiter-Saturn conjunction going from earth signs to air signs. And his take is that we are going to have a big transition to a much more equitable and ecologically sensible type of economic system. Not necessarily we're all going to become Marxists or all governments will be socialist or something like that, but just that we have to change this mindset that because you're a billionaire and you own a bunch of factories, you get to pay as little as you can get by with because it's your right to do that. He also had some interesting things having in a more short term, like back in 2020, talking about the Mars retrograde. And when the sun transited each of the spots that Mars went station, those were key days in the development of the vaccine. Either there was an announcement that they had a vaccine or the announcement that it had been approved and they were going to start releasing it in large amounts, something like that. But it was very strongly correlated with Mars stations, either stationary, retrograde, or direct, and then the sun hitting that spot. So it's fascinating the way he took to look at very short term, you know, in months cycles, and also very long term in terms of thousands of years cycles. And it all seems to have tied together with the basic idea of changing our economy. And of course, the pandemic made a lot of people have to work from home. So now we have this big shift about does everybody have to go to an office? You know, can't many people just keep on working from home? So it's sort of like chipping away at this idea that the rich and powerful have control over all us little guys who have to go to a factory and punch a time clock or go to an office and sit in a cubicle. Anyway, that's the sort of overall gist that he developed by looking at all these different transits of short, medium, long term.
Thanks, Frank. That's a good synopsis. Does anybody else have a quick comment they'd like to chime in with?
Yeah, I just had one thing. I was looking at my notes, and what struck me was that he said that the chart of the Federal Reserve was that of a casino.
Oh, yes. I have that written down here too. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was funny. That's it.
That's quite appropriate. Quite appropriate with what's going on today and just manufacturing of money, just the printing of money, you know, just print more money.
I
Okay.
think he
well,
said
we-
something about Bitcoin too, didn't he, Tom? Do you have that in your notes? I don't have
I
mine.
haven't found that yet. I have a lot of notes. I took a lot of notes with him. I find it interesting that right now, Gail sent me an article about Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum and his background being of Nazi parentage. But that, his famous statement at one of the conferences was, "You will own nothing."
Own or owe?
Own
Own.
nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
well, if you don't own anything and I don't own anything, well, then who owns it? That's what I want to know. Yeah.
Yeah,
Very
that would
few.
be,
Very
that would be
few.
preparing everyone to be perpetual renters for everything. So who would we be paying rent to?
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's definitely,
Uh,
this is definitely a return to feudalism in their minds.
Yes, I think that's what they mean by the Great Reset, right?
Yeah. I don't know that Roy Gillette used that term, the Great Reset, but that was basically what he was talking about. As I kind of about how he was tying it all together into this transition in attitude and thought to a different way of running our civilization with the economy.
So ultimately, the question, apparently there is no question there's going to be some big change, but who decides what that change is and what direction it's going in?
Yes.
Is it people like Schwab, or is it us?
Good point. Yes, exactly. That's the question that's still up in the air.
My goodness.
If
Okay, Bo had something to say about
Excuse
Ren Butler that she didn't get to say at the time. Bo, are you there?
Oh, we don't have to switch the subject right now. I just wanted to make a clarification on a couple of things that Derek said. Ren, I used to live in the same city. I've moved a bit up island, but I've studied with Ren and even done journey work with him. But I just wanted to clarify about the perinatal matrices is the name that Groff gave to those stages in utero, and that the birth process is, there's 4 stages, and each one of those corresponds to the outer planets. And that the amniotic universe that the fetus is within is the Neptunian reality. And then as the body prepares for birth, the contractions start, and there's a kind of no exit engulfment is the words that they use to describe it. And that's very Saturnian. There's all this pressure and seemingly no resolution. And then the cervix begins to open and the fetus starts to get pushed toward that opening, but it's a death rebirth struggle to actually be born. That's Pluto's domain. And then once the breakthrough of birth happens, it's a Uranian kind of explosion into something entirely new. And so my background is also as a therapist, and definitely a Jungian. So this type of archetypal astrology really appeals to me. But the premise on that is that we have residues left over from the birth process, and they're stored psychically in the soma of our body. And so that if we don't actually release these residues, we play them out in life in terms of how we interact with others. And so by the use of holotropic breath work or even psychedelic use, that these residues get released over time, as long as you're in a safe, contained place where you can actually allow them to be expressed through. And then the other part that goes with the planetary transits is that the timing for these, for the use of breath work or psychedelic journeys, if you can look at the outer transits, you can find the most conducive time or optimal time to do those release sessions and really use the planetary energies to assist. And the other piece that I really think is so cool, is that even if we're someone who follows our dreams, that there are very predictable symbols or types of symbology that show up based on which planet is really having an impact or effect on us, that there's a consistency in some of that symbology to know how those things are actually working their way through us. So I had my chart done with Ren in addition to studying with him. And one of the things I loved about that initial is that he takes the houses and the signs right out of it in the beginning and just looks at the planets and where they are and how they're aligned with each other and what those clusters archetypally are like in the blending of them. And in his books, that's very much Archetypal Universe was his first. And then he has a very recent one, it was just published last year, called Oh Goddess, Love, Eros, and Transcendence in Astrology. And he's very much about the blending of the archetypes, whether in individual charts or in relational or synastry kind of work. So I just wanted to add that piece because, Derek, about that all 4 planets are part of that whole birth process and involved in it. So I kind of nerd out in the archetypal astrology stuff. So I just thought I'd make that little correction. And I didn't listen to the lecture.
Yeah. I wasn't going to kind of recapitulate his entire lecture or anything. And I just, in the chat, I just put in a link to his website directly.
Perfect. Yeah.
And yeah, I was just trying to emphasize the fact that what Ren Butler was talking about, in terms of planets and personal stages and development, also related to some work that another astrologer had done. And I'm perfectly fine with disagreements and working out.
Yeah, it wasn't really a disagreement, more of an enhancement, that's all. And I did try, but then we moved on to just add that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you both. And as Bo was talking about that, those planets and this, I mean, I think we could apply this symbology to what is happening with our country, with what's going on in the world. I mean, we're kind of like in the birth canal, right?
Yeah, and if you have any big dreams, it can be fun to look at the symbology and really look at comparing it to the planetary energies. Because sometimes if you clue into it, then that symbology will start to repeat and expand, and it can be a relationship more with the astrological side than just, what does a mouse in a chariot mean to me? It's sort of like it. I love that interface when working with the planetary energies and the dream symbols. It's really cool.
Really, very, very, very cool. Very good. We got to trot on through some more speakers. But I'm sure, this is a great discussion. Love it. So in November, we actually had Dale O'Brien on November 18, 2020, speaking about USA Paradigms of Fear. Does anybody present today want to jump in there and say what they might have heard, learned about that, what they've noticed since? Raise your hand. I really liked it because it brought to my awareness. Well, Dale was using that chart from the Articles of Confederation, that chart from November 15, 1777.
Actually, I was using the Howland chart. American Astrology. This is Ronald Howland in the UK, and in here he actually has from the Library of Congress the notes of the timing of the Declaration of Independence. Okay. Most people use the Sibley chart, and the Sibley chart was based on Thomas Jefferson's memory of July 4th, but they went back and found that Thomas Jefferson, he said he was there all day, and he went shopping for gloves and a telescope. So if his memory was, I can't remember exactly, what I was doing that day, but the notes from the Library of Congress actually had it that it was in the morning, that the USA was in the morning, and then Howland comes up with his time here, which is late Virgo ascendant, and I use early Libra ascendant. So that was actually a 1776. I do look at both charts, the Articles of Confederation for the secret elite who actually run the country, but in terms of the country itself, I use the July 4th, 1776.
At 11 what time?
11:18 or 19, it's the same chart.
11:18 a.m.
Yeah.
But you were referring to the position of the nodes and the return of the nodal cycle every 18 and a half, 19 years, when the nodes return to those early degrees of the North Node, would be at the early degrees of Cancer. I think that's what you were referring to in your lecture. Is that right?
Yeah, it's 2+ degrees, and so the paradigms of fear was what was going on each time that the nodes were at 2+ of Cancer Capricorn, and that would be square the ascendant descendant of the chart that I use. So yeah, that's what I talked about.
For the Libra rising chart, then, for the Declaration of Independence, if it was erected for 11:18 a.m. And very interesting lecture because of all the examples of the new iteration of fear that's brought forth every 18 and a half, 19 years, but to keep the populace in responding from in a way to that that's another thing that they have to fear. That's is there anybody else on the Zoom today that would like to talk about Dale O'Brien's talk, that paradigms of fear? Do you have anything to say about?
Gail, a lot of the stuff I mentioned when I was talking about Philip actually came from Dale. He's the one who alerted me to the Neptune opposition Neptune that was happening when Pluto returns in 2022. I was looking at my notes, and he says that Jupiter gives and Pluto takes, and I like that. That summary, that meme or whatever you want to call it. He talked about George Washington, and that he had prompted me because of that to kind of research George Washington, and I did not, because I know absolutely nothing about the so-called father of our country. And he mentioned George Washington was a master spy. And I did not know that George Washington was involved with many, for the English, in many battles that had nothing to do with America. And so the whole history of America, I don't think very many people really know the history of the founding of America. So I do appreciate, getting those leads. I did have a question for Dale, and that was that the right eye is the sun and the left eye is the moon. I wrote that down, but I never pursued what exactly that means, that's from astrology. And could you comment upon that, Dale?
I was told that Ptolemy came up with this, that when you're dealing with any type of medical astrology, and someone's having an eye problem, there'd be like an affliction to either the sun or the moon, depending on which eye. The reason why I mentioned it is when we look at each other eye to eye, our left eye will face to face. Our left eye will receive the light of the sun, and vice versa. And I just thought that was just a beautiful part of the beautiful poetry that is astrology.
Great, thank you. Any other comments about the November?
I just want to say, if anybody is interested in my approach to astrology and historical research, I've got a free newsletter just came out, and this is relative to the subject that we were talking about, and it's the only one who will ever own us is the son of a Nazi man, and this is about Klaus Schwab. And Bo, I think you'll find this interesting because I go into a lot of what it was like to be a child growing up in Germany and turning 6 years old when he did, and so forth. So anyway, it's free. A Chiron guy at Pack Info.
Talk about trauma in the childhood, leaving a lasting impression. But Dale, maybe you could put your email address in the chat so somebody could contact you and order that, get you to send them that newsletter.
May
I
I-
read it. It was fast. Great.
Question?
Yes, Bo?
Phil, I didn't get to hear the lecture, but when did you calculate this current paradigm of fear as kind of coming into influence?
Okay. Well, what I did is I studied the 9/11 experience, and I knew that something was coming in the spring of 2020 that would be, a real, fear-based game changer. And then what I did is I went back backwards. So a lot of us are old enough to remember duck and cover, where we're hiding under our desk for this, and also cumulatively in the American psyche, whenever we have something like the first one was at Valley Forge, and there was the fear of disease, because a lot of people were dying of disease in the camp. There was 15,000 people in unsanitary conditions. They were dropping like flies, and of course George Washington is worried that he's going to lose the revolution and get hung. So we have these cumulative traumas that come through. So not only is it the historical events, but what will press the buttons of the American people.
Cool. That corresponds with the timing of the fourth turning too, doesn't it really? That 9/11 and kind of.
Yeah, exactly. In terms of the fourth turning, the authors of the fourth turning both live near CIA headquarters, and they've advised the CIA.
Wow.
Yeah, we're in deep.
Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Dale. When I'm listening to our speakers, my fingers can hardly keep up to make enough notes, and then I never seem to get back to the YouTube. But that's great information. As I tried to note down about every return, you have all the way through. I think it was 2020 was the fourth return of those nodes to that second degree of Cancer. So accumulative trauma. That's a very good way of putting it. Thank you. Okay, so we should then move on to a panel with Susie Cox, Steve Weiss, Lene Van Horn, December 12, 2020. What's coming up in 2021? I think somebody said they wanted to comment on this. Jane, was it Jane? Did you want to comment on that panel? You have to unmute yourself. Liz Shearer, I think she said she'd chime in on any of these, but Jane, there you are.
Hi there. Yeah, I took a few notes during the lecture, and I just want to say how helpful it's been over the last 7 months. I guess my comments are kind of limited to how it's impacted my life and the people around me, but especially remembering Susie Cox and how she laid out in really simple, understandable terms the main things to look out for or be aware of coming up during the year. And I've been shopping for a house, so those dates have been really important to me, because right around the date she mentioned, things came up, blockages and whatnot, that prevented me from buying a house at the time. So yeah, I guess that's about what I have to say about that. I always look forward to that every year, and all 3 presentations were really excellent. So.
Thank you, Jane. I really appreciate your sharing how you've used that material. And you say that you purchased a house, or you're in the process, or you paid attention to those dates?
Yeah, I tried to purchase a house, but the timing was not right. So, and the lectures helped me to understand why the timing wasn't right. So.
Okay, great. Yeah, Susie kind of whizzed through what to expect as far as when the aspects were occurring. Steve Weiss put it into geographical perspective. I mean, he talked about the astrocartography, map lines. There's 3 different type of map lines. There's celestial, which we most often look at in the astrocartography world, those cardinal points that are, and he said those are subject centered and real. The geodetic degrees that are earth centered and abstract. Saphiriel actually came up with that whole idea of putting the astrological, the zodiac around the earth, and so it's very abstract. And then there's the local space, which is directional energy, showing the flow, the azimuth. But he pointed out, a couple of associations. He was using the chart for the first of the year set for Washington, D.C., and he talked about there were several connections with China, the China Sea, things that have been a problem, of course, that showing up for Washington, for the U.S. in our relations with China.
Yeah,
Moscow.
If I could mention
Yes, go ahead.
something regarding that. Yeah, he mentioned that the celestial Pluto in the US chart will be going over China. So,
Right.
Given our theme of Pluto return and China, maybe China will be a key player in the US Pluto return. And they also mentioned that Pluto would be going over Baghdad. I'm not certain I remember how that works out, but that's in my notes. I will mention one thing about Stephen. I'd heard him up in Phoenix, where he is from, years ago, and it was in November, and he was showing the astrolocality charts. And he made the statement, at that time, he showed that the Saturn line was going through Tucson. And he said, in January, something horrible is going to happen in Tucson. And sure enough, we got the Gabriel Gifford shooting. So I thought that was prophetic. He kind of downplayed it when I mentioned it to him a few years later, but that really stuck in my head when he said that, because he was pretty serious about it. I think Susie gave probably a more positive view of 2021 than Stephen Mark Weiss did. Yes.
Yeah, well, that's Susie's job.
Yes.
Is to
Yes.
give us a positive frame with which to view our upcoming events. And Steve, to give us a more, maybe a real world kind of thing, but he in one of his previous, maybe that was that lecture you referred to, Tom. I remember one of the lines that he was commenting about what's something coming up. It's kind of predicting that the Deepwater Horizon event in the Gulf of Mexico. There was a certain line that was going right through that spot that showed there'd be trouble there. So it can be very useful to look at all three of these ways of looking at the map lines. It was the Pluto of the U.S. local space chart that was going over China in 2021-22, and the geodetic Pluto on the IC going through China and the China Sea. So he was resourcing from all three ways of looking at the
yeah, he also mentioned the celestial Uranus. The IC line was going through Moscow. So
right,
yeah.
Right. So, and then Lene, anybody want to talk about Lene's? I mean, she was quite, she gave, I took a lot of notes. She kind of gave her idea of what we might be expecting with the Neptune square the nodes, and Jupiter square Uranus, Saturn square Uranus. Anybody have anything in their notes about that they'd like to say about Lene's presentation?
I found her take on, our nutation, going, the Jupiter Saturn going from the earth signs to the air sign. She said that right now we're living between the earth world and the air world, which I found was an interesting statement. You know,
there was something she said about the planets being all on one side of the chart in that New Year's chart. Kind of imbalance kind of situation that we're coming into this year, feeling of imbalance. And then she took up a theme which Georgia Stathis followed, in our in June's presentation, but that these last quarter squares, the Jupiter square Uranus, as well as the Saturn square Uranus, being the last quarter phase of their cycle, their relationship to each other in the current cycle. So which is imbalanced, disintegrating, that kind of idea.
yeah, one thing she also mentioned, besides the fact that we're going into the Jupiter Saturn 200-year air sign, she said that all three Mercury retrogrades this year would be in air. So that was kind of interesting. Yeah. So we have that to look forward to, the next two for this year.
How many other people enjoyed the Mercury retrograde in Gemini? Anybody else notice how? I've got a new desktop computer now thanks to Mercury retrograde. Liz, what do you?
I just want to, well, I went through, my blender broke, my toaster broke, my refrigerator broke, my computer, I lost everything. 4 years of astrology from my computer, had to replace that. I'm trying to recover some of it. It was just a massive, and then I went to Norwalk at the end of May, and I think Saturday was the first day that the Mercury retrograde. It was Friday it stationed, and Saturday I believe it started retrograde. Everything went haywire that day. Everything that was nice and smooth, the first workshop, it was just great. They couldn't get Galaxy Room open. It was just one thing after the other. But it's a group of astrologers, so everybody knew what was expected and kind of went with the flow. It was funny. It was a toughie.
Yeah, I've had to. My desktop computer blew out, and I didn't realize, I only found out in that Mercury retrograde period that the backup that I thought I'd been doing for my computers, that Seagate backup, actually had disintegrated, and it did not back up any of my computer information. Fortunately, this company here in Green Valley was able to get some of the documents and the files off of my old computer. But it was a real learning curve, learning how all these electronic things do disintegrate, and that even my surge protectors that I was using, well, they were probably at the root of the problem. They went out. They weren't protecting my equipment, and I had to replace those. And then I've installed new programs that I'm trying to learn how to use for everything. And my brain is definitely being worked. So I guess there's something to say for that.
When we had the Aquarius retrograde last winter, I had an electrical blowout that I had to get. It actually blew part of the circuit breaker out. So in attune with the electricity of Aquarius, I thought that was appropriate. And I'm going to be driving to Albuquerque when the Libra one hits. So I don't know, maybe I should take a plane.
Oh yeah, when is that Libra one? Oh dear. Anybody have their notes in front of them? Might want to be aware of that one. Susie gave that those dates, right?
September 27th to October 18th.
Oh, great. That's just another one to keep in mind, you know, if we're thinking about reopening it as a physical, our physical meetings. The venue thought they might be ready by September, but with the Saturn and Jupiter still in retrograde, I thought we better move that out and not plan on September. I moved it out to October, but with the idea of Mercury being retrograde, I think we'll be learning, if the physical venue is available, I think we'll be learning a lot and dealing with a lot of glitches possibly with the Mercury retrograde.
Yeah, that would be, I think that would be a good time for us to do a dry run and test the facilities first, as we discussed before. That would be the right time.
Yes. Okay, moving along. We've got Mark Jones in 2021. Mark Jones, January 9, 2021. The role of planetary nodes through collective evolution. I don't know about anybody else. I need just a couple of minutes of break, but Tom can carry on. I think Tom has a lot to say about Mark Jones, and I'll be right back with you.
Okay, yes. I think Mark started his talk by saying something to the effect, well, there's so many things you have to consider when you look at a chart. Do you really want to have to now use the nodes of all the outer planets? You know, right now, I think everybody knows that the moon's nodes are extremely important. You know, they're associated with our dharma, our karma, our previous lives. So they are very significant in the chart. The other, and as we know, the moon's nodes, and actually the moon's nodes even affect the real estate cycle. So I was always amazed that somebody told me that the real estate would bottom out in 2009 when the North Node was in Capricorn. I forget which it was, where it is, which means that right now we're at a real estate high because it's 9 years later. It'll bottom if you add 2009 and 18 or 19.4 years, it would bottom, you know, toward the end of the 2020s. But the last time this happened, when we had the real estate crash, it went straight up almost to the very end. And then in 2009, we had that precipitous drop. So anyway, wasn't part of Mark Jones's talk, but I thought I'd just mention, we all know about the moon's nodes and we know the retrograde. What's interesting about the planetary nodes is that they all go forward. There is no retrograde motion in the nodes of the other planets. So they're always going forward, and maybe that has something to be said about evolution going forward. I had bought Mark's book, The Planetary Nodes, because his talk did impress me greatly. The problem you could say as an astrologer with clients is that this is not going to affect them because it mainly affects human society, human evolution, and not so much individuals. The thing that I wanted to get across from his book is that, say, the Jupiter nodes or the Saturn nodes or Pluto's nodes, they may only change a fraction of a degree over your lifetime. So unlike, looking at the nodes as they're going through your chart, the moon's nodes, your nodes are pretty much going to remain in the same place your entire lifetime. So the only way you would use them in an individual chart is when a planet goes over those, like Jupiter's nodes, or goes over Saturn's nodes, or goes over Pluto's nodes. And his talk was mainly about our human history, more so than individuals. But he does cover that. He covers a lot of people and how their planets would go over the nodes and what that would trigger. So I still am in the process of, this is very abstract. If you think Dane Rudyard is abstract, this is equally as abstract. In fact, he mentions the history of planetary node research, and he mentions a 1965 paper. Then he mentions Carl Payne Tobey, and then Dane Rudyard, and then Zipporah Dobbins as having written an article here or there. But he really is the one who's doing the main heavy work to get this, our consciousness as astrologers to examine the planetary nodes. So that's really all I have to say. I'm still reading this book, and I haven't really applied this to any charts yet. So does anybody else have anything to say about this?
I'll just make a comment, and I just
Yeah.
ordered his book, so I haven't read it yet, but he did
Yeah.
say, he was talking a lot about what was happening now on the planet, and pointing out Saturn-Pluto nodal conjunction along with the Saturn-Uranus square, and in relation to politics and climate change. And then he also pointed out, and I was looking at the chart that he sent, that the Pluto, with a lot of wars historically, and he pointed out a lot of wars historically, that when Pluto Neptune did their nodal conjunction is
30,
when
yeah.
the wars ended. Yeah, there were several wars that ended. I think the War of the Roses was one of them, the Civil War. So we'll see. And I was thinking, even though this wasn't related to the nodal aspects right now, but we do have Pluto sextile Neptune, which I said could account for the increase in tropical storms, melted glaciers, along with our human intervention as far as climate change. I was trying to correlate what he was saying with what's actually happening at the moment. So that book is a tome. It looks like a tome. I'm waiting for it.
I would also interject about planetary nodes, which of course exist and have been measured, but astrologers have not really used them very much until more recently. And this book by Mark Jones is a great addition to it. But Philip Sedgwick also uses planetary nodes very much. I don't know how much he does in terms of reading charts, using interpretation, but he gets a lot of information about what sign the node is in to get some indication of the planet, not just the ones that we know, but whenever a new dwarf planet shows up, Ixion or Quarawar or Sedna or things like that. In his blog, Skyscraping, he'll say, this is first discovered and the node is thus, and so it would appear that it has this type of a characteristic. He can get a lot of information in his blog writing, at any rate, out of planetary nodes. So it's highly valuable for Mark Jones to do all this research and get more detail of it and write a big book about it, a tome, as you put it. Very, very true.
Thank you, Frank. I was going to mention, one thing he did mention was that when Pluto went over its own south node, you had 500 abbeys in England that were destroyed over the course of 20, 30 years. So again, this Pluto destruction, and then, you know, if you want to call it regeneration, out of the destruction of the Catholic abbeys came, you know, the Anglican Church, and you know, the kind of the elimination of that form of monasticism in England. So that was one, you know, interesting example. So, yeah.
I was going to add one comment in there too. I don't pretend to understand it fully, but I know that I was really taken with that lecture, and it caused me to order the book, which I have, but I haven't read. So the tome is still waiting for me also. But two things really grabbed me. One was the way he talked about Neptune as being the dream of civilization. And he talked about the Christ point. I thought it was really interesting. And South Node Saturn, the monastic, yeah, he was talking about the Islamic conquest and stuff, but he asked the question, are we now facing a Pluto struggle about the original spiritual impulse of the Western civilization, but following that arc of meaning about Neptune as that Christ point and tracking Christianity. So that's something I wanted to follow up on through the book. And then the other, and I don't really know much of anything about the other planets and their nodes and how all this works, but how, again, back to the Saturn-Pluto alignment, and about the nodes of Saturn-Pluto being epoch-defining periods of the rise and fall of empires and countries and rulers. So he was saying that in the modern era, what happened in 2020 is the first time that with these two planets that they're on their own nodal axis, both of them. So yeah, about a power shift and to do with all of that hidden dynamics, a crunch, the bang on conjunction, and then Mars joined in. So it just, yeah, it really piqued my curiosity. So, but I haven't waded all the way in yet. So.
Thanks. Oh gosh, I can't deal with, something has cropped up on my screen and I can't see everybody, and I'm trying to get rid of it. So anybody else still with Windows 10? There it is. Okay.
Well, we can see you.
I noticed.
We can see you.
That's great. Yeah.
And so can the Chinese.
I managed to find out.
The Chinese.
I've managed to fix.
Yes. The Chinese,
yeah, right,
because they own Zoom. So there you go.
It was something about Mark Jones. He says about the nodes intersecting the ecliptic and the relationship of our Earth to the Sun is what we're looking at, and Saturn nodes affect our relationship with the Sun, the spirit to soul. I don't know. I wish I had. Made more of notes, but there's always, so maybe you can find out more about those things in that book that you're reading. Okay, computer, it keeps telling me I've got this or that. I don't know. Anyway, traveling on through the year, Alan Clay, February 12th, 2021. The blessings of Ixion, Pluto's new lawless brother. Who would like to say something? Diana, did you say you'd looked at a little bit of that?
I looked at some of it. I was not able to finish it, and I'm trying to find my notes in this notebook. You'll have to come back to me. I'm still looking. I don't want to take up time.
You said something about looking at some of your friends' charts, the position of Ixion, and you found that very interesting. And it was nice to hear that somebody had put this to use, looking at those positions of Ixion.
Yeah.
You can find find out more about Alan Clay's work at Dwarf Planet University, he put together a whole website.
Yeah, I was looking at the not conscious, I'll say, and the conscious or manifestation of Ixion, and but I looked at someone I know with fourth house Ixion, and it was my granddaughter's beating on her drum, and it was right on. The hospitality could not be there, or it's, I guess, just very different, or I guess following your own drum, so to speak. Yeah, the hospitality of this person is just oblivious to anyone visiting, just totally. And he's a Virgo, so in another lecture I heard that early degrees of Virgo is they're learning to be a Virgo. So maybe that's what it is. I'm rambling. So anyway, I'm still looking for my notes.
Oh, Bo, okay. See you later. Thanks for being
Okay.
with us.
Gail,
Yes.
I was motivated to study Ixion in depth with Alan Clay. So
Great. Please take it away.
well, I've said a lot here today. I don't want to dominate things, but I just wanted to just say that what I found interesting is what Alan inspired. He didn't actually talk about. It was actually Bill Cerubi, who was also in the class, and he was the one who brought up this point of curiosity. He said, when we're dealing with a planetary object that is that far out, it's going to be definitely a big influence on the collective when it gets to the cardinal degrees, the first degree of the cardinal signs. So that got me, of course, what I do, motivated to research this. And what I found is when we had the rise of the fascist in the right before World War II, we had Ixion on the first degree of Libra off and on, because like any other planet, it'll go forward, retrograde. And now it's on the first degree of Capricorn. So Cyber Polygon was on the first degree of Capricorn yesterday, or on the 7th. So yeah, I think it's definitely something to watch because of the whole idea of Ixion does not play by the rules. And so when we're dealing with a whole new orientation of people who don't play by the rules, last time it was political. This time it looks like enormously uber powerful, wealthy individuals at World Economic Forum.
I was going to say, yeah, Ixion will be in Capricorn for the next 24 years, according to my notes. So yeah, that's
the critical time, as we would expect with any significant planetary change, whether it be Pluto, Neptune, whatever, is when it changes signs, things change. And because of the retrograde back and forth, to go back into the last degrees of Sagittarius, forward to back in the first degree of Capricorn. But to jump the gun a little bit, speaking in the Sabian symbols, the last degree of Sagittarius is the Pope, and the first degree of Capricorn is the Indian chief. So it basically is like, well, who's running the show? In some sorts is the issue right now, and there's definitely a change of who's running the world, or who wants to run the world.
I really liked Alan Clay presentation on Ixion. I had been studying that with him, so I didn't take a lot of notes. I'm going, gee, I don't know where my notes are, but Ixion is on my ascendant along with Neptune. It's right in the same degree as Neptune. Neptune's in the same degree as my ascendant. So I always like the idea of it's and Dale just said the perfect words that, but what Alan did was he looked at the way back when Pluto introduced it, when Philip introduced Ixion, talked about its habit of doing the same thing. Ixion was known in myth for doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results, thinking it was going to get the, but there, Alan brought out the positive side, the more evolutionary, spiritually evolved side of and he does that with all the planets he talks about. So I'd like to think that maybe in my later years, I've learned how to use the more positive, spiritually evolved, but I've definitely been one of those, like Diana said, and your grandchild beating on a drum was so perfect, dancing to the beat of a different drum. And that's always been my life, it's always been kind of outside the box, dancing to the beat of a different drum. So I'll just leave it there. There's many ways that's manifested in my life. Anybody else want to?
I just had a couple, and amazingly, I was going to say what you said, Gail, about I appreciated the fact that he used his spirituality, because clearly Ixion can go the other direction, and he related him to certain things of certain number 45. But I like the spiritual component of that. And also to the person that was talking about Ixion in the 4th house, I have that also, but I have it in Libra. So my house and my hospitality has always been about having a house that's pretty. Even when I had no money to my name at all, I always had artwork in my house that my friends drew, or, I still have a lot of that stuff here, because, you don't have to be owning Matisses and Picassos to have your house beautiful, but the hospitality component is extremely good. But another comment that he made about that, because Ixion seems to be, I don't know, there's a juxtaposition to the good and bad in Ixion. And one of the things he said about the 4th house people was to own your own bad girl. And I thought, because I've always thought, of course, you as you age, you go through all that stuff and it's gone, and you learn your lesson. But it's nice to look back at your life and being able to release. I have Cancer rising, so I'm pretty sensitive. Being able to release the mistakes that you've made in your youth. And I thought, thank you for that. And I think these dwarf planets, I would love to study with him at some time as well, because I like the way he presents things. He has a great sense of humor. I think he's very knowledgeable. And I think the dwarf planets are going, as astrology progresses in the next 100 years, I think are going to be pretty significant in our charts, just like Pluto is. Look how much, I'm reading Lily right now because I'm redoing some horary studies. So I'm reading the 16th century horary book in Old English for Lily. And look at the differences of what we have knowing the outer planets versus not. And I think the same thing is going to be true of Sedna with AI and Ixion and everything else that he's putting out there. So kudos to Alan Clay.
Great. Thank you, Liz. I think one of our listeners today, I say, because I don't imagine she's going to chime in with this, but gave me 3 questions that she wanted to find out, to have answered if possible. And I think one of these is appropriate for right now, because she was listening to Mark Jones on Pluto, but as she says, as I read different sources, there's conflicting information on Pluto, especially if it was written before 2000. Is there an evolution of astronomical knowledge? And of course, we had the motion of Pluto. The IAU, the International Astronomers Union, decided that Pluto shouldn't be qualified as a full-on planet, that it was only a dwarf planet because it didn't clear out its the space in a certain way. And at the same time, Ceres was promoted to dwarf planet status, because both of these bodies are circle the Earth, circle the sun, go around the sun, and they're round. That seemed to be help allow them to be classified as dwarf planets. The full larger planets clear out their space. But anybody want to say anything more to that question? Is there conflicting information on Pluto? Anybody want to say anything about that? Okay. Yes. Well, the astrologers certainly weren't going to hear it about Pluto being demoted to anything less than a full-on planet, because like Liz was talking about, the more more objects we find, all these objects in the Kuiper belt, this huge region out beyond Pluto, that contains a lot of bodies that we're discovering that are round, that we're calling dwarf planets, and it's going to take us a bit of time to really explore and understand how these bodies relate to us, personally especially, but it's about the evolution of consciousness for sure. Okay, so moving on to Lynn Ewing, February 13, 2021. And Carolyn Coleman has volunteered to speak up about, so Carolyn, please speak up.
I just want to say, since you mentioned Mercury retrograde, my computer has been saying my internet connection is unstable. So let me know if you have trouble hearing me or seeing me, and I'll maybe try to move to another room. But I just want to say there have been so many fantastic presentations this last year, and it's so great to review today. It's really, kind of brings it all back. But if I, since I was asked to choose one, I have to say it was Lynn's talk that affected me the most personally. And secondary progressions were not something I had delved into as yet, either in my chart or in other charts I've been reading. Just there was so much else to cover. And, boy, was I wrong. I was wrong, because I've really gotten so much out of it since her talk. She spoke of secondary progressions as having a potentially profound effect on our internal evolution and soul growth that can really be a catalyst for significant change that comes from the choices we make as a result of that. So in essence, the way I was looking at it is this internal evolution can result in external revolution. And I was really fortunate in that I was one of the, I think, 5 or 6 people whose chart she reviewed. And I've come to find out that for the past 2 years, my progressed moon has been in Cancer. And not only that, it joined the sun, the ascendant, and Mercury all in Cancer, which was really eye-opening to me. And I actually did some research looking back on when those shifts took place, and I'll just share that in a minute. But just as a side note, natally, I have sun 23 degrees Taurus, ascendant 26 degrees Taurus, Mercury 28 degrees Taurus, and the North Node 6 degrees Taurus. So I'm quite Taurian natally. I do have my natal moon in Leo 1 degree. I do have 2 planets in Cancer, Venus, and in fact, the moon just went over my Jupiter in Cancer about 20 minutes ago. So I had Jupiter in Cancer as well. And of course, there are a few similarities between those 2 signs, especially the need for security and comfort, which I can very much relate to. But I just want to just throw it out there, just some of the changes that have coincided with these shifts, these secondary progressions into Cancer. First of all, my progressed ascendant moved from Gemini to Cancer right after 9/11. September 11th, 2001, as we know. And this was a time when I was really close to my family. Even though I was living in Tucson, I asked them to show up for me in New York City on November 4th, I think it was November 4th, for an event I was doing, which was only 6 weeks after 9/11. And then 4 years later, in January 2005, my progressed sun moved from Gemini to Cancer, not 2 months after I moved from Tucson back to my hometown, and to be closer to my family. So fast forward 14 and a half years, in August of 2019, my progressed moon went into Cancer, and my husband and I were back to Tucson looking at houses here with the plan to move here, and I would be moving back here. And though we didn't find anything at the time, we returned to California, we put our condo on the market. And I was also really intent on finding a home in the neighborhood I used to live in when I lived here 16 years ago. So again, the third house influenced where all those progressed planets were. And I was really fortunately, to find a house in that neighborhood. It was just a blessing. You know, at the time I was kind of looking at that big life shift back to Tucson, wanting to change locations. I was looking to Uranus passing over my north node 3 times. And every time it passed over my north node, there'd be the condo went on the market, the realtor was called, we shifted, but you know, it really coincided with that shift too. But now that I am understanding this other layer, it really makes sense on that level as well. And thanks to Lynn's talk, this new awareness of these shifts and these progressions has really helped me understand myself better, especially the changes in my personality. I gotta say, I definitely find myself being a moodier than I remember being in the past. I have a tendency more toward just being more introverted, more sensitive. I tend to ruminate over things more, what I've said, what I've done, and taking things more personally, I guess, which is it's been challenging. Also, an increased desire to be a homeowner, really to be a homeowner and a homebody. Sometimes staying home for 5 days at a time without realizing it. Since we moved back to Tucson, we just recently completed construction of a pool in the backyard, and I do aquatic therapy and aquatic fitness all privately. And so now I'm able to work again out of my home, which is great. But I have a feeling it's that, again, the water and being at home, the Cancerian influence that could be, and also working with neighbors in my neighborhood. So it's kind of all along that third house Cancerian influence. Previously, when I've owned property, it was more of a practical matter or more of an investment for me. But now I really feel like it's more, I would say I'm becoming more domestic, which I would never describe myself as before. And also another thing I've noticed is I'm far less talkative than I used to be. I find myself actually getting kind of tired from talking. I do a lot of talking for my work. And I tend to be more of a chatty person previously, but I find it tiring now, which I thought might be kind of due to that progressive Mercury being in Cancer retrograde, as opposed to my natal Mercury in Taurus, which is not retrograde. Interestingly, I find to myself turning inward, more of an inward reflecting self. My husband's progressed moon recently went from, he's natally a Scorpio moon, and he went into Sagittarius right around the time we were vaccinated. And he's all kind of gung-ho to get out in the world. And I'm still kind of, I thought I would be, but now I'm still kind of more interested in staying in than getting out in the world, which is just not the way I've seen myself in the past anyways. So I also love to perform. I am a Leo moon natally. I'm a ballroom dancer, and we used to do a lot of performing and competing. And, I used to love to do group classes, and now I'm definitely more comfortable Zooming with our coach. She's in California, but we have a studio in our house. That's fine with me. I don't necessarily want to tell about, and we are going to go into California in a couple of weeks to compete again. And I gotta say, I'm definitely more nervous than I would have been in the past. 2 years ago, I would say. It's been about 2 years since we competed. And this moon at least has been in Cancer for about 2 years, progressed moon. I'm also following the moon a lot more. I find that's really helpful. Every 2.5 days, kind of seeing when it's changing signs. I find my moods are really reflected in that, much more so than I found in the past. The moon is going to progress back into Leo on October 28th, which I'm really looking forward to. Hopefully that'll shift things a little bit for me to be wanting to be more out in the world, being the performer and just want to be more social. My niece is getting married 2 days after that shift in California, so we'll be going to that. So hopefully that will be a coming out party maybe for me a little bit, I'm hoping anyways. So just want to wrap it up by saying both in my own chart analysis and readings I done for others, I've kept things fairly basic, and I'd previously chosen, not to add that extra layer. But as a result of this talk, I found it so helpful when exploring my own chart. I'm really considering adding that and, that layer especially with people that are coming back to me from a second reading. Anyways, thank you. That's any questions, or that's all I have to say about that.
Thank you, Carolyn. I mean, that's really good advice to astrologers. I mean, if we really work with something relative to our own charts, then we're more confident in offering that to our clients, right?
Exactly.
Anybody else on Lynn Ewing? Anybody else?
Yeah,
that,
I just wanted to say a couple little things because I use this kind of like how this affected my life and looking back at things. When I first started studying progressions, it was through Bernadette Brady's stuff. So I thought Lynn's presentation was really focused and easy to follow, which I found quite nice. So I went back and looked at a couple things in my life that had happened. A couple good things, one good, one bad. And one bad was when my son passed away, my progressed moon was conjunct my natal Venus in the 5th house of children, and my progressed Mars was in a separating square from my natal 7th house moon, severing relationships. And it was like 3 years before that I moved to Tucson. My natal moon was conjuncting my progressed Mars. So I should have known this was going to come, but this is nice in doing readings for somebody to see where Mars is when it's progressing as to how it may be affecting somebody that might want to make some changes. And I know, Carolyn, you did a lot of that. On a positive note, in August of 1964, I won a pretty significant swimming award that could have led to the pre-trials for the Olympics, which I declined not to do. But at the time, my progressed sun was conjuncting my my natal Saturn and Neptune. So perfect for swimming and vitality and everything. And I was swimming at home. We had an Olympic pool at home. My father was a swimmer, was an athlete. And yeah, I didn't go further with it, but I thought right now Mars is now in my 8th house. So I'm just crossing my fingers with it.
all right. One of the nice things about this Zoom today is getting to know all of you just a little bit better. It's really terrific, and to know how our people that are coming to the Zooms are experiencing this. This is great stuff. Anybody else want to make a comment about Lynn Ewing and presentation on progressions? Okay, so next after Lynn Ewing would have been our March presenters. And so on March 12, 2021, Kaylin Castell and Tammy Brunk talked about the current Venus cycle is the cosmic medicine of a new destiny. Is there anybody here on the Zoom today that remembers that or wants to say anything about that lecture? I particularly love to have Kaylin and Tammy on that evening, because there is a lot of love and laughter in their presentation. You could feel the love coming out, radiating out from it. I don't know if anybody else noticed that. And Saleeve, you're unmuted. Did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I really liked that talk. I can't remember the specifics of how to describe it, but it was a good one.
They were talking about the Venus cycle, of course.
Yeah, I know that.
They're really involved with taking people through that Venus cycle. There's a meta goddess. Every 584 days, Venus begins a new cycle as she rises heliacally before the sun. And
right,
she becomes
it
a
has
new
to do with
overtone.
the Inanna going through the gates. And I remember several years ago when Kaylin gave another talk about every time Venus conjuncts the moon and it represents one of the gates of Inanna, and you base it on how many times was Venus and the moon conjunct after it was retrograde to find which chakra point is activated for you.
I'm sorry that I had stopped your video share, Saleeve. If you want to resume your video share, you're welcome to do that.
It doesn't let me.
Oh, it really?
Because once you disable it, it doesn't let me come back.
It says to ask you to come back. Is you're moving around a lot, and anyway, Tom, maybe you can help with that. But at least we could hear you,
Yeah.
and you have studied.
It's
with
tricky. I'm
Caitlin
going to
quite a bit.
have to get my computer looked at on Monday morning. And so I can only use my cell phone for Zoom. And like I walk around, I get things to eat and drink, and that's just how it goes.
Okay. So anyway, the meta goddess of this current Venus cycle is Gemini, Venus in Gemini, and they talked a lot about rewriting the story. Telling ourselves a different story is really important to, because everybody gets stuck in the way they tell their story, talk about this. And we see that. I've seen so many instances since they gave that talk about how our society gets stuck in a certain type storyline, and they just keep repeating that and repeating that instead of realizing that at any time we can start telling ourselves a new story. We can look at our history from a different perspective. We can see a traumatic event or any kind of event from a different angle, from a new perspective, and start telling a new story about it. But we don't have to stay stuck. And so there was this opportunity during this cycle, this Venus metagoddess Gemini cycle. Right now, she's come out from the underworld, and she came out and met the North Node in Gemini in conjunction with Aldebaran, and that degree was particularly significant. I remember pulling it up at the time, maybe, and I mentioned it to Linda, and she had that chart as part of her, when she was talking about the Sabian symbols, she talked about a lot of the degrees around that area, but it seems it all kind of tied in together, that conjunction with Aldebaran and the North Node at the 10th degree of Gemini, and how we need to think of rewriting the story, writing new stories in order to move forward and evolve. Anybody else want to say anything about that particular degree? Anybody else want to say anything about the cycle of Venus? Here is the degree that Venus, as she's come out from the underworld, you can see her again, and she's meeting with the North Node and Aldebaran. That Gemini 10 was an airplane dives toward the earth as though falling. And then moving to Gemini 11 was newly open lands offer the pioneer new opportunities for experience. Both Gemini 10 and 11. I'm reading out of Linda's book, and maybe we can say some more about it as we move on to, when we get to talking about Linda Hill and the Sabian symbols. Okay, so following Kaylin and Tammy's presentation on Friday evening, the next day was Gemini Brett, March 13, 2021, talking about joy and sorrows, the sorrow cycles, celebrating the cycles of shadow. Anybody want to say anything about that presentation? The sorrow cycle that we're in, or how it applies to us. Gemini really laid out quite a lengthy description of how those eclipse cycles, the sorrow cycles, is pertaining to the eclipse cycles. He gave great illustrations of how those cycles can be plotted on the picture of the Earth, and how they move from the pole, North Pole, to down further. Anyway, it's hard to describe what somebody did so well in that. And you're certainly, if you're a member, you can ask me to send you that YouTube. But it was quite he did a fine job of illustrating what those sorrow cycles meant and those eclipse cycles in terms of his own life history. Anybody else want to say something about the sorrow cycles or the eclipses, eclipse patterns?
I
I
just
did
think
learn
they're
a little
extremely
bit.
significant because I had last year when I think I talked to Daniel about this, when the Saturn Jupiter Pluto conjunction happened in January or right around the eclipse, it was conjuncting my natal moon. And it was, if you ever want to have an experience of what an eclipse feels like, that would be the experience to reiterate. And I wouldn't suggest anybody ever do it. Again, I was so glad when Saturn Jupiter moved into Aquarius on the 21st, because it was like a light lifted. But Brett is very knowledgeable with all the astronomy related to astrology, and the way he teaches it is, I think, more detailed than some of the other people that I have encountered. It's almost harder for me to keep up with him because I'm such a beginner.
I was going to say that I learned a lot more about Black Moon Lilith from that talk Jim and I gave, being the orbital foci, F-O-C-I, and so you can, it tells you a lot about the position of the moon and whether what, where I can't begin to explain it, but it's about the lunar apogee. A true Black Moon Lilith only correct at full moon. It's about the metonic cycle. Anyway, it was quite interesting to get an astronomical, again, yes, he was very good at incorporating the astronomical information with the astrological information. Anybody else want to jump in and say anything about that? Okay. Then I know we've got some people that want to talk about Linda Hill, April 9, 2021. She talked about what we can learn from the Sabian symbols about 2020 and 2021. Both Jane said she'd say something about Linda Hill, and Dale too. So Jane, what did you want to say about that talk?
Hi, yeah, I really enjoyed her talk. Since COVID, my brain has a hard time taking in like a lot of data, information, and analysis and everything. And when she spoke, it was so digestible and meaningful. It could make sense to me. I could apply it to my life. I love how she talked about her experience from Australia. A lot of times I read stuff in the news and I never know if the news is actually accurate anymore. But for her to be in Australia talking about what she's experiencing there, that really opened some doors for me. I also like how she tied in the COVID event along with the Sabian symbols for some of the degrees that were apparent. One of the symbols that I really like is 9 Taurus, and it's a Red Cross nurse, warm with empathy. I think that's what it is. And that's my midheaven. So when I hear that, it helps me reframe what it is I actually do for a living, because I'm in social work. And there's a lot that has to be done in the context of a job, but it helps remind me to stay steady and stay with compassion when I'm working with people that can sometimes be pretty angry or impaired at times. But I really enjoyed her discussion of all the different symbols that she brought up.
So when you said your ascendant, was that the degree of your midheaven?
Yeah,
and so we always have to remind people that we're rounding up the degree. So your midheaven's at 9 degrees some minutes, and you rounded it up to 10 degrees, and that's the Red Cross nurse with warm sympathy.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Any other degrees jump out at you that she talked about?
That was the main one. And also there was a symbol of something about hand washing, which I didn't write down. what exactly that was, but you know, it's just interesting how that tied together with the COVID event that she was talking about.
Dale, do you know which degree that she was talking about, the hand washing, or did you?
I don't know which degree she was talking about, but as we know, just in terms of just the speakers that you had this year, there are amazing astrologers out there of all sorts. But I've known Linda for so many years, and truly, she comes to this work with love, absolute love. It started off that her father was very much impressed by Edgar Cayce. So she was really open to the idea of that there could be psychic guidance that could come from sources. And so when she learned about the story of Elsie Wheeler and the Sabian symbols, she went completely into action. At a young age, she went to Turkey, to Petra, where the Sabians originated, and the Sabians were spiritual people who believed in the connection to the astrology, and their gatherings, you know, like at solstices and equinoxes, were open to all religions. So there was this kind of, you know, we're all universal humans, and the term Sabian came from Mark Edmund Jones' study group that he and his little group believed that they had reincarnated from that group there. So she actually went to Petra because she wanted to come from, you know, where did the Sabians come from? Then of course she's Australian. She came to the U.S. and she researched the life of Elsie Wheeler, going to, you know, where she was born and looking into the records and everything. And that book, the wonderful book that you held up there, Gail, is an entire labor of love. She has just poured so much of her own money. I mean, she clearly operates at a total loss. And it is because she is trying to put out there to everyone basically the love and helpfulness of the Sabian symbols. And it works at all levels. You know, using these as a form of divination, as well as using them in astrology to better understand oneself, as Jane was just talking about how helpful they are. But I also want to point out that they're excellent for trying to rectify an approximate chart, particularly if you're trying to do your own chart. Because the literal imagery will be, you know, sometimes people will go, oh my gosh, I got a picture of that hanging up over my fireplace. Or things like Elizabeth Taylor, her first breakthrough role was National Velvet. And she's got the jockey on the horse in a race. So what's great about this is quite a contrast to the previous speaker, is we can come at astrology through the intellect like Brett and just really, you know, bring in the science. But what's great about the Sabian symbols is you don't have to know any astrology to be able to access the Sabian symbols immediately and apply them. Particularly if you have a good sense of intuition, working with dreams, and a sense of humor, because they can work as punts. So I just want to, you know, get across the feeling of what a lovely soul motivates Linda to do what she did. And I don't think that she was able to come across because of the urgency of what she was going through in her life in Australia. So, you know, in easier times and happy times, she's just like one of these people. It's such a delight. You go, oh no, it's only been 4 hours. Do you have to go already? And so I just wanted to get that spirit of her across for everybody. And also in terms of the cost, it's like getting that book now is very expensive. It was expensive to get books from Australia before, but it's very expensive now. But it is truly, I would encourage every astrologer, if you're only going to have one astrology book, get Linda's book.
Of course, you can go on her website if you have a question and you want to, the website, the Sabian symbols .com. I think that's where it is. But her website, you can ask a question and pull up a degree, or you can check out the symbols for different points in your chart on that website. So it's a very, very handy website. If you can't get the book, you can still access the Sabian symbols on her website. And or you can get a reading from her. It's certainly not hard to get a reading from her. If anybody wants to really go in depth, I think she is still available. You could do it over, by Zoom. But she has suffered quite a bit from this over the last year. What was going on in Australia was very drastic, and so she was noticing how serious the Sabian symbols that were highlighted in the charts for 2020 and for 2021, they were very, the seriousness of these degrees. So she probably looked at the 22nd degree of Capricorn, or the 23rd degree, I believe, where that big conjunction and eclipse happened on January 12, 2020.
Gail.
Gail, just one more PS. She apparently hasn't been with us today, but Susie Cox and Linda go way back. So whenever anybody has a chance to talk to Susie, just ask her about Linda Hill.
And also that I see that Cece has left, but Cece made a 30-sided die, had a 30-sided die created that you could roll along with the astro dice, the dice that give you a planet, a sign, and a house. You could also roll this 30-sided die and come up with a degree of the sign, so that you could go look in the Sabian symbol book for, we have a question and you roll the dice, you now can get the Sabian symbol. I found that so amazing over and over again when I used that tool and get the Sabian symbol. Anybody else have anything to say about? Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, hi. I had, about the time I had discovered the Sabian symbols, I was living in LA, and the biggest metaphysical bookstore in LA was called the Bodhi Tree. So I was perusing the astrology section, and I found a book called The Degrees of Life. And it was by a person, Chandra D. Mathri, and I had no idea who that was. And it turns out, I believe the Mark Edmund Jones meeting with L.C. Wheeler was around 1923 or 25, but Mark Edmund Jones actually didn't produce his book on the Sabian symbols till 1953, I believe it was. So I had gotten his book, and then I got Dane Rudhyar's book, The Astrological Mandala, and then I'd gotten the Linda Hill book over the years. I have to say that the best book is the Linda Hill book, because it's the best written. It's more, goes into the symbols, the oracle, the keywords, the caution. So it is definitely the book to get. But I was puzzled by this other book that had all 365 degrees of the zodiac, or I'm sorry, the signs. And I liked the interpretations. They were different than the Sabian symbols, but it was more mystical, a little bit more cosmological, a little bit more romantic. And I did get something out of it. So I just want to let you know there are alternative interpretation of all the degrees day by day. And then I discovered I'd gotten another book called The 360 Degrees of the Zodiac by Adriana Corelli, who talks about the individual interpretation of every degree going back. He mentioned historical people like Pietro dell'Albamo, and then he mentions there's another book that is The 70 Degrees by Cherubel, and also by Sephariel. And the Corelli book mentions the degrees that Alan Leo had. So Alan Leo also had his take on what every degree meant. So they're all a little bit mysterious as to how these came about. Obviously, we know that Elsie Wheeler had gotten them by divine tuning into them, and they seem to be the best, but there are other interpretations going back, to the 1200s, and even they talk in those books in the 1200 talk about the Thebans, which are not Sabians. Sabians are mentioned in the Quran, and they're mentioned in different historical books, but they mention the Thebans. But again, who the Thebans were, they're Greek, but we don't know anything about them. So it's interesting, I must say, that there are many interpretations, some of which are very similar. The Corelli guy did not like Alan Leo's interpretation. So when he was examining the 5 different peoples, he threw out the Alan Leo interpretation. So I do find that interesting.
Thanks, Tom. I mean, we know that astrologers all have all these different ways of looking at astrology. Everybody's the astrologers are quite Uranian. They're all have their unique perspectives.
I did find it interesting with Linda that she mentioned a couple anagrams. She was thoroughly, obviously, disgusted with the lockdown methodology that went on in Australia. So she mentioned if you transliterate face mask, it comes out to fake scam. And then she mentioned Australia being, if you switch around the words of Australia, it becomes a trial USA. So I just thought that was comical. She was just totally frustrated. You could tell by all the limitations of travel and everything else she had to deal with there. So, yeah.
Thanks.
I'd like to mention that if you do a search on the PDF that I sent, I do try to categorize books in constant ways, and I think there's a category column, so you can search for degrees for any of these books. Because I do believe I have a number of them in stock here. And maybe
Great plug.
And 3.
Great plug, Derek.
I think I've got at least 3 copies of Mark Edmund Jones' book. And maybe even Linda Hill's on CD.
Thanks, Derek. If anybody wants to do some further research, there's an opportunity. Okay, moving on. The next day after Linda Hill, we had Steve Weiss back again to do a talk about his book that had just been published. So Steve Weiss, April 10, 2021, the 96 incarnations of personality and soul purpose are revealed by the sun sign, the moon phase, and the Hollywood stars. He had lots of charts of people that are Hollywood stars to give as examples. Each phase of the moon through each sign of so you got 12 signs and 8 phases. So you come up with 96 incarnations. Does anybody want to say anything about that presentation? Anybody attend that?
I loved it. It was super informative and helpful. I mean, even though I've already seen a lot of talks about moon phases, like each one gives me new ideas of how to interpret it for other people.
I would also say the same thing. Obviously, I'd read Dane Rudhyar's book on the moon phases, the lunations, but to have it applied, those 8 phases to each of the signs was very enlightening. And he gave examples. So for every sign and what person, if they were a Libra, what moon phase they were born under. And that was, just as also very enlightening. So I find it is a good tool, just like the moon sign's a good tool. It's very significant.
Anybody else have a comment? I didn't take many notes until he got to the gibbous phase, which is my phase, and he found out that I share the gibbous moon with Steve Weiss, and so I could definitely relate to the fact that the gibbous moon person processes everything through the mind. Okay, it's kind of like Virgo. Anybody else? I hear somebody.
Let's see, I'll go grab my notes. Let's see, I have them. Yeah, I'm looking through the celebrities he put for waxing gibbous: Bill Gates, Paris Hilton, Donald Trump, Newt Gingrich, Edward Snowden, L. Ron Hubbard, Isaac Newton, and Kim Kardashian. What a combination.
And that's your phase as well, Saleeve, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Because when you're one before the fall, it's like waxing gibbous is an exciting one, but it's also a very tense, anxious one, because it's like the feeling of almost there, what's going to happen when the full moon comes.
Good point. Good point. Yeah, I didn't mind when he said Leonard Cohen, but when he said Bill Gates and Trump, I go, oh God.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, you know, and hearing these lectures and hearing who has similar parts to each of our charts. I mean, does that encourage in some way compassion? I hope, and to see how we're all humans. We're all humans, so we're going to have similarities to each other, even if we really dislike that person. There's something in that. If we're pointing the finger at somebody, there's three fingers pointing back at me, and I'm noticing some similarity, whether I like it or not.
Yeah,
So here's another way astrology can help us understand that.
The way I see it, we're all permutations of the same stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the next speaker was May 15, 2021, and that was Gary Caton, talking about the working with extra zodiacal constellations and stars.
I took some notes on Gary.
Oh,
I liked
good.
his presentation a lot. I made notes about the discussion of Draco because I can completely relate to this. I have Draconia on my ascendant along with Persephone. Draco, I'm also born in a dragon year in Chinese astrology. So it's pretty intense in my chart. Plus it's such a huge constellation. I think it influences everybody. When he talked about Ophiuchus, I have the eye on my Mars in the 6th house, which I found really interesting because he said it emphasized the third eye and detoxification. And when I was a young child, I had premonitions, dreams, visions, and things like that, kind of like what Dave Campbell ended up doing, and was kind of being guided down that pathway towards being a profiler, but it was just too much violence for an 8-9-year-old kid. So I elected not to use that information in my life. But there was another one, and I remember the spelling. I wrote it Algugi, 21 Sag also conjuncts my Mars within a couple of minutes, actually. And some of the examples he used, which were Fred Astaire, who my mother danced with when she danced on Broadway, Prince, who was my son was his electronic engineer up in Minneapolis for a while. Mary Travis was probably who I tried to emulate when I first learned to sing when I was a young person. And then Lewis Carroll and Mark Twain and Ezra Pound. I mean, good company there. So I enjoyed really using that. And I also liked, and I think this goes for all the speakers, but I wrote down his website of the constellation of words. And I also have Sirius on my ascendant, and I found this little poem in that particular website. I found it very helpful with the stars, with all the different fixed stars. Sirius, a fiery light there flashed like autumn star that brightest shines when newly risen from his ocean bath, shines eminent amid the depth of night, whom men the dog star of Orion call. That was on that website. It was from the Iliad, but I just thought that was very nice to use that reference point and how we as tag members can go in and use some of these clues that are laid in front of us with our speakers.
Beautiful. Thank you, Liz. I'm really grateful for you reminding us of that website, Constellation of Words, because he used a number of, he referred to that a couple of times. I was particularly taken. I felt like calling him up and getting a reading because of the way he, brought so much new information about the connection of the stars. These stars don't have to be right on the zodiacal band. They can be anywhere in the sky and still have a connection with your chart and personal planets and angles. Because they're on the same longitude, or maybe they rise at the same time as a point in your chart. So it's definitely interesting. I have Sirius on my midheaven, and I've always thought a lot about my connection with Sirius. But if you look up at the sky, there's a lot of space between 13 degrees of Cancer, a planet on 13 degrees of Cancer, which is right between it's right in the constellation of the twins. And where Sirius is, I mean, that's a long ways away. It might not even have risen, or you look at it, you can tell it's a long ways away. Yet that star has a big impact on my chart and who I am too. Sometimes, did I come from Sirius or Sirius B or one of those?
I always thought so. I've always related to that star, even long before I learned astrology, just looking at the stars when I was a kid.
Yes. I did like what Gary said about the eyes of Draco the dragon being connected to some very powerful people that you might call the elites, and that the dragon really is very greedy. That's what the dragon lore, you always find the dragon sitting on a mountain of gold. And the fact that you could connect up the stars in Draco the dragon, particularly the eyes, with the personal points in some of these charts of the elites really made a lot of sense. I mean, the fact that they are just wanting more and more and more, it's hard to understand. But when you think about, there is this connection. Anybody else?
Could I say something, Gail?
Yes.
When Gary had presented his topics, a lot of people in our steering committee were not too certain about having him present on some of the other topics. I had meant to pursue that. I have not, but Gary's an expert on medieval astrology, alchemy, hermeticism, and he had mentioned Albertus Magnus. Albertus Magnus was a medieval magician who was the teacher of Thomas Aquinas. And interestingly enough, even though he was a magician, the Catholic Church canonized him as a saint in 1910. And he'd mentioned a book by Albertus Magnus called De Mineralibus, on minerals. And so in the medieval times, they would focus the star energy on the minerals to create powerful astrological amulets that would carry power. So that's something that I've always wanted to investigate further.
What was the first word of that book?
Oh, it was De Mineralibus, which, mineral, basically mineral. It was de, which means of. So
Right.
de and then space mineralibus, which would mean on minerals, basically.
Right.
So that was very common practice with the astrologer alchemists, was to create powerful amulets that would carry power of the stars that would be embodied.
And the Picatrix, which he also mentioned.
Oh, yes.
Which also for talismans.
Yeah, which is another magical text that all modern magicians refer to. Yes.
And some astrologers, I think Austin Coppock uses it a lot in his magic astrology teachings.
Yeah, so I've been wanting to do more with fixed stars, particularly looking up Bernadette Brady, and he mentioned Diana Rosenberg, and other astrologers that have used the fixed stars in astrological delineation.
Yes, so much food for thought there with that lecture. Okay, so we have one more person on our list, and then we'll take some other questions. Georgia Stathis, June 12, 2021, the importance of synodic cycles. What phase is it anyway, and how do I fit in? And talking about the synodic cycles of the outer planets. I believe somebody wanted to talk about that. Was it Frank or Liz?
I can talk about Georgia. I actually went back and watched it again, and I think I need to watch it 2 more times because there's so much information in her topics. But what I liked about it, I went back and looked up some of the things that she discussed. And one of them was music and the changes in music genres. And I went to jazz, which was always, one of my favorites. Looking at the conjunction of Pluto, Neptune, and Gemini at 6 to 7 degrees in 1892, which was also my grandmother's birthday year. So that was kind of significant to me. And then in 57, end of 57, 58, Pluto sextile Neptune and Jupiter conjunct Neptune at the end of the year was Chuck Berry's release of After School, the beginning of rock and roll, is my opinion. And a lot of Coltrane stuff came out around that time. There was also in 1812, when Beethoven wrote his last symphony, there was a trine with Uranus and Pluto. And then the other thing that I looked up that I was interested in her references was the spiritualist movement. And I know she brought in I think the perfection did come in 1892 with Gemini, Jupiter, Pluto, or Neptune, Gemini, Pluto. In 1890, it started and it perfected in 1892. But at the beginning of it was 1848 with the Fox sisters in Heights Park, New York. And there was a Pluto-Uranus conjunction in the 8th house, squaring Mars, Jupiter in Cancer at that time, which I thought was, if you know anything about the spiritualist movement, these sisters started channeling and had all these psychic impressions, and that's how they started this spiritualist church, which was a complete break from the Presbyterian and the Christian churches at that time. So I thought that square was pretty significant. And there's many, many more.
Really?
I wanted to mention one of the
Yes,
synodic cycles that she mentioned was the Jupiter-Neptune, which will be next year. So, Jupiter will catch up to Neptune and be conjunct, and then begin a synodic cycle of 11.9 years, which I thought would be longer, but I guess Jupiter won't be having as many retrogrades or whatever. So she said that would be about inflation and vision. So we can look forward to having spiritual vision during that synodic cycle, hopefully, and widening our horizons. And
maybe another musical genre will appear.
oh, maybe, yeah,
Yeah,
could
because
be.
that's
Yeah,
also significant for that one.
that's right. Yeah, that's they both involve music. Thank you. Yeah.
If we apply the idea that she used with Saturn being in its waning square with Uranus to Jupiter being in that last, the last phase of its cycle with Neptune coming into that conjunction. I mean, it's kind of the breakdown of the previous cycle, right? The previous cycle of inflation or inspiration. What did you say, Tom? If you think about Jupiter and Neptune being about inflation or inspiration, and this being toward the end of the cycle of that previous time, if we look back, okay, so 12 years from approximately 12 years, when would that cycle have begun? Then it would have been about 2009, 10, 2010, and maybe that, that would have been, it would have been ending, that the previous cycle of Jupiter to Neptune would have been ending right during that 2008, 2009 financial crash, wasn't it? And the chaos that produced. And so we're in that kind of relationship now with Jupiter and Neptune. It just strikes me as kind of a similar feel to it, perhaps. There's this kind of this chaos, a breakdown of that, the financial institution, maybe another sign of the breakdown of the financial what's the word? Anyway, somebody supply a word. Frank, what did you have anything to say about Georgia Stathis? You talked about applying it in your life, didn't you?
Sorry, I was muted there. Thank you, Zoom, for flashing a little notice on my screen when I started talking. Actually, I didn't. I think maybe you were confusing me with somebody else. I really did enjoy her talk. I echo a lot of what Liz just said, but I didn't make notes on it. Well, I took notes when she was speaking, but I didn't make notes for today's talk because I wasn't planning on talking about Georgia.
Yeah, we had an exchange. We had been talking on the phone or something not long after her lecture, and we both remarked that we found her information very useful, something that we could apply.
Right. Yeah, very much so.
Anybody else want to chime in about Georgia's lecture about phases, synodic cycles? Okay, we have just a couple more questions that Maureen had sent me. She had a question about the significance of progress charts and how that presents in past and present life moments. Maureen, did you get that question answered when we were talking about Lin Ewing? You want to say anything? You can unmute yourself and say something.
There we go. I think of it, or this is the paradigm I was thinking of. Is it a sort of like a nature nurture, like your natal chart may be your genetic, your progress chart is how you're working through your life? I mean, is there a connection between those two, or that you can learn from, or that was my thought.
Well, I follow along these lines myself, and the way I reason about it analogically is that, yeah, your natal chart is like your genetics, but your progressions are like the working out of your genes as you progress. Different genes get expressed as you mature, or as they're influenced by the environment. And I think that's about where progressions fit in.
Well,
Some have compared the progression set to the natal chart, which is like the blueprint. And then what happens is the building is being constructed, then you have adjustments to make, and the way and how it unfolds and how it evolves over time. And you can certainly see that in people, how they evolve over time period as they go through these different phases, the phases of the moon. The moon is the easiest to watch. The progressed moon, it goes into a new sign every about 2.5 days. And so, I mean, the progressed moon would be 2.5 months, because in basic time, the moon goes into a new sign every 2.5 days. So that's really by observation, and Carolyn gave a perfect example of observing how things have unfolded in her life as she compares it to the progressed chart.
thank you.
Maureen had one other question about shamanic astrologers speak strongly to me. Our ancestral family is strongly rooted in Celtic places, and I must say that it's one of the things that draws me to shamanic astrology, was the connecting the earth and the sky, and working with the timings, the celestial timings, actually physically out under the sky. Okay, some other comments. We've gone on quite a while. We haven't gone on this long since we had Gemini Brad on Saturday.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Diana.
I did think of one other thought that came to me as I was listening to Zane Stein's talk on Chiron. And he talks about, the 50-year cycle of Chiron, and the Roaring 20s, and then the free love in 1970s, and then the 2020s. And a thought occurred to me, and I don't know if anyone else thought of this, but we hear a lot about the transgender movement. And I'm just wondering, it's not exactly Centaurian, but it's going from one sex to another, and then there's just all these other different labels that are popping up that I don't understand. And I'm just wondering if anyone else has thought about that as well, because transgenders are really in the news now. So, and it's raising a lot of controversy. At least in I have a family member that I was having a discussion with, and so I'm just wondering how many people are really transgender and have been keeping it in the shadows, and now it's just coming forth. So that's it.
A really
Yeah.
good question.
Dale? Yeah, Dale, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. Whenever we're dealing with anything in astrology, we're dealing with issues. So we can take our own political things and set them aside, and we're going to believe what we believe. But in the origin of Chiron trained individuals to go against odds, and many of these people were in political, military sorts of situations. And one thing that happens sexually is that when a heterosexual male was a long time away from women, there was a form of sex that wasn't considered homosexuality, believe it or not, but it was inner thigh sex. So like one guy would insert his penis between the other guy's thighs. Now the whole thing is it's like, well, why are they doing this? It's like, well, see, we're under unique individual circumstances, and what I've seen with Chiron related to sexuality is that when someone is trying to decide, like they're 13 or 14, and the astrology is basically saying they're kind of like, am I gay, am I straight, am I bisexual, and whatever. When we get that kind of ambivalence, that's where it comes in. But then when we get into the politics of this, it's like, okay, if a given individual is going through this phase, should they actually have the physiological operation? And then that gets into the whole thing about the age of consent. It's like, should a teenager be able to make this decision? Will they change their mind later on? But again, it just lays out the issue.
Astrologically,
Frankie?
it might be very interesting to try and figure out why transgender issues have come to the forefront in public, in the news media, in politics and all that. Since it's something that's been around for a long time, but is sort of like recently coming to light, I wonder if maybe it could be one of the outer planets that, take 500 years to outer dwarf planets, trans-Neptunians, that take 500 years or something to go around the sun.
Well, it could be that, but the other thing is we have these new planets that are coming in, the so-called dwarf planets. But other than Ixion, these are feminine, and so we're getting Eris instead, and we're getting very different stories of the feminine that are coming in. And I don't think anything in astrology is necessarily like, this is a monopoly and this is where it's coming from. But I think that definitely needs to be factored in.
I wonder if, I know in evolutionary astrology, they say that if your 4th, 10th house has the Capricorn Cancer axis, depending on which one lands in the 4th house, this is the gender that you've changed from your previous life. And a lot of people in the LGBT community operate on, especially trans people, operate on that axis. Now that was 4th, 10th, but last year, we just went through the moon's progression through Cancer opposing Capricorn. So I'm wondering if that's when everything came out politically. It would depend on where it was in each individual's chart, but maybe some significance.
Are you speaking to a progress chart, to the US chart, or what, Lizzie?
I'm speaking, yes, of an individual's chart and their Capricorn Cancer axis in regard to, individually it would be 410 in evolutionary astrology. They would have to have that natally. But if they did have that natally, and then that was what part of their life story was, how did that relate to, last year's opposition of the Capricorn planets to the Cancer nodes? It was the Cancer North Node, I think, that was opposing those planets last year.
Yeah, well,
and this is when a lot of it came out into the public eye. That's my curiosity.
What I'd like to suggest is also that Neptune opposition, which is in the U.S. chart, which is square the U.S. Mars. I don't care which chart you use, the earlier in the day or later in the day, the planets are in the same in that basically same position, and the Neptune opposition, which is in play now with the natal square to Mars. There's got to be this confusion about a masculine identity. And then we add all these feminine dwarf planets, all the rise of the more feminine power. And then you add the population crisis and the fact that there are a lot of rats in the cage, same cage. And maybe Mother Earth says that we want to stop populating. There is this general urge that everybody feels to stop engaging in regular and there's so many ways that that's playing out with the foods and the chemicals and everything. There's all those ways that there's not as much ability to have children in the first world countries, especially, you know, where we've ingested so many chemicals. But there are also so many people in close proximity that there's maybe an urge to the evolution of this or this issue is coming to the foreground. I think it's all about that Neptune opposition, but I don't know. There's so many ways you could look at it, so many perspectives. If anybody else wants to chime in. Sleeve says phytoestrogens in food causing hormonal confusion. Men have less testosterone than they used to. Definitely. From Diana to everyone contribute. What do you mean, Diana? The sperm count is gone.
No, I'm not used to this Zooming, and I thanks for having the opportunity to listen and contribute. I left that off and I put that in. It's a little loose. I do have to go. Thank you so much. I appreciate this.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
I just have to throw out how synchronicity works. This doesn't relate exactly to the astrology we were talking about transgender people, but just last night, I was talking to my niece and found out that one of my nephews, a 25-year-old computer engineer, ASU graduate who has spent his life named Stephen, has come out as being transgender and has started hormone treatments and wants to be called Emma. And then hours later, here we are, you know, on the tag Zoom call talking about this. And I couldn't help but think, well, isn't that a coincidence?
Yeah, we're losing some people. Some people have to go. It has been a great discussion.
Yeah, well, we've been going at it for like 3 full hours.
Three hours officially. 3 hours. Yes, I say
it's past 4 o'clock.
So. Anybody else want to chime in before you have
I just
go?
want to ask Dale, what was the birth chart of the Articles of Confederation? The date?
Okay, it is November 15, 1777, York, Pennsylvania. And my late friend David Salte had written a book called Scorpionic America. We use just a slightly different chart, but yeah, it's the Sabian symbol is the wood that's cut for summer use, which is 20, because I don't remember the exact time. I think Sabian more than anything else. And it is.
You said when you draw it up, do you set it to noon or midnight?
No. I actually he rectified the time again based on research at the Library of Congress, and just as with the July 4th, there was a window. There wasn't an exact time, but we had a window for it to be in the morning, and the Sabian symbol is 27 plus of Aquarius.
So 28
for the ascendant.
28.
Yeah, 28 Sabian symbol. So whatever time that is, yeah, that's the time that I use. And David's chart, that's 1 p.m. And David's chart, I think, is just a little shy of that.
Thank you.
Yes.
So yeah, the symbol, a tree felled and sawed to ensure a supply of wood for winter.
Yeah, and if you've ever seen a map of what this country looked like before people came, there's tremendous forest from one end to the other.
Right, yeah, yeah.
And the rivers were prolific with fish.
Oh.
It said that in California, you could walk across the back of the salmon to get to the other side. That's how prolific the fish were.
I've seen pictures that were renditions when I have a degree in anthropology, and we were doing a lot of study on Native American in the Potomacs, and the Potomac River was the same way. I can't imagine that now.
When I was up in Sequoia, there's a museum up there, one of the lodges, and they showed the population of grizzly bears being all along the coast of California, all the way down to San Diego.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've really changed the ecology of North America much more than we realize. There's a fascinating little snippet from the Lewis and Clark expedition. First, I want you to visualize North America when they started out in 1804, when huge forests were still all across eastern US, as Dale mentioned, and the buffalo had not been, exterminated yet. So to just hike across North America for when they started out at St. Louis, I guess it was, and went all the way across the Great Plains and into the Rockies, and Montana and Idaho area. And you can just imagine how lush and untouched and the density of the game and the birds and the wildlife and everything. It must have been just awesome, even accounting for the fact that there were Native American tribes all over the place, because the Native Americans lived lightly on the land. They would hunt deer, they would fish the streams, but they didn't put up huge dams that stopped the salmon runs. They didn't kill tens of millions of buffalo just for the buffalo hide. So anyway, Lewis and Clark came to a valley in the mountains in Montana that their Indian guides told them was a no man's land, because there was a tribe that lived to the east of the valley and another tribe that lived to the west of the valley, and they were always at war with each other. So anybody that wandered into that valley would easily likely be killed if he encountered a member of the other tribe. So Lewis and Clark are hiking across this valley with their Indian guides. And in his journal, Lewis recorded that it was just amazing, the density of the herds of elk and deer and buffalo, and how many grizzly bears they saw, and how many packs of wolves they saw, and the density of the bird flocks. So what would it take for Lewis and Clark in 1804 to be impressed with, wow, look at the wildlife in this place? The mind boggles. And we don't realize that was just 200 years ago. And now we go hiking in the Catalinas or in the Rockies, or, go river rafting someplace. And we just think, well, this is the way life is. But really, like salmon being side to side so closely that you can almost walk on their backs across a river, the true natural density of wildlife is just mind-boggling. Not there, but it's a fascinating image.
It brings to mind, I had printed off this it's a material that a fellow gave to Daniel about the Chiron returns, because here we are in the US chart. We're not only at the Pluto return, but we're also at the Chiron return, as well as that Neptune opposition. But it's interesting. He said it was at that first Chiron return in 1924 that kind of set things in place for this continual cycle of destruction, I think, wounding, because it was in 1924 that the US Supreme Court ruling that established principles for interstate commerce, ruling against steamboat monopolies, but it paved the way for entrepreneurs to become ultra rich. Cornelius Vanderbilt made a fortune after that ruling. His net worth in 2021 inflation adjusted dollars is reported to have been 223 billion, making him richer than the Bezos today. But it's kind of like it got set at this Chiron return that that set the U.S. on this course of where the rich got richer by their continual greed of turning the resources into profits.
Excuse me.
1924, but wouldn't that have been 1824?
18, did I say 19? I'm sorry, 1824, yes.
Yeah,
March
50
to
years.
1824.
Yeah.
There was also a presidential election that Andrew Jackson won the plurality of votes, but the House of Representatives voted in favor of John Quincy Adams, and the death of the two founding fathers, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
Vanderbilt's wealth was squandered over the decades. Obviously, one of his heirs was Gloria Vanderbilt, and her son is Anderson Cooper, who was in the CIA. So it's very interesting, the legacy of that family. Yeah.
He was in the CIA?
Yes.
I did not know that.
He was, yes.
I knew he was an adopted son.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's the theme. He wrote it out here. This is compiled by Greg Neal. A definitive turn towards money and power and control by business and industry, created and endorsed by our constitutional architecture. Watershed moment. Well, I don't know, it takes a lot of pain for anybody, any person to change. It probably is going to take a lot of pain for this country to change. Wasn't that a positive note? Anybody want to offer some positive notes before we end our...
Well, Roy Gillette didn't make any hard and fast predictions about, somebody who's going to be elected president in 2024, good or bad, or, whether we'll have a giant recession in the late 2020s or whatever. But his interpretation, as I kind of touched on, of all these long-term cycles and the transits connections to the USA chart, has kind of a positive ring to it. There will be, of course, some difficult transitions. We had things like, the big foo-fra about Trump claiming he won, and the rioters crashing into the Capitol building on January 6th, and things like that. But 5, 6, 7 years from now, his overall attitude is it's probably going to have been settled down much for the better. Although who knows what sort of upsets we're going to have, in the next 3 or 4 years.
I've got something positive to say. And it's a Chiron thing. You might expect that from me. The Chiron trained these heroes and everything, and they always were going up against usurpers who had seized power. The kingdom had physically going into decline. People didn't have any money because all the money was going to keep the army going. And then against all odds, they would win. To bring that forward to the modern era, true story, there was a young woman in her high school gym class, and she really wanted to go to the Olympics. And her coach said, you only got one chance in a million to get into the Olympics. And she said, you mean I have a chance? And she went, and she got a bronze medal.
Yeah, just open the door a little bit and say, you got a chance, you got a chance. I remember looking at the progressed US chart, back years ago, maybe 2010 or something. I was looking at the progressed chart for the US, and I was thinking to myself, well, by 2032, maybe things will start to come out of this trend, but we'll see. Okay, Lizzie, thanks for being on with us. I think we should all...
One positive things to say, but I was driving, so I can't give you the exact source. I believe it was Science Friday. I was listening on my car radio, and it was a female who does research on crustaceans and so forth. And it sounded like it was getting far, and it was really getting difficult to listen to. But then she went on to talk about, because the water's so acidic and it's warmer, about the ability of these creatures, because all shells are made by a little critter of some kind. And we kind of detach from that. We see the beauty, the aesthetic of the shell, but we don't connect it to the little creature that made it. But she talked about how so many of them have been able to adapt through these different changes. So it was a very positive ending to something that sounded initially very alarming. Not that we can't take anything for granted, but evolution is real, and hopefully it'll tide us over until we can figure a few more things out.
All right, thanks. Anybody else?
Well, thank you very much. It was just an incredible meeting. So much to learn.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.